good morning, and a very warm welcome to the Scotland Agronomy Roadshow 2022. My name is Richard Meredith, and I head up the Arable Knowledge Exchange team at AHDB, and it's my great honour to be chairing this event today. So, we were just saying that the panellists, we'd much prefer to be sat in a hotel with you today, having a shortbread and a nice coffee in a warm room. But sadly, the circumstances weren't to be this year, so we've had to move everything online. It was our intention to do it in person, but we had that taken out of our hands. But I'm just going to, nonetheless, we've got an excellent programme for you, lots of different speakers and different topics to cover, and loads to go through today. So it's my job just to run you through the housekeeping and a bit of an AHDB update and an overview of what we're aiming to achieve today and how we're going to approach it. First of all, there's a Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. Other people can't see your questions and answers, so please do kind of ask any questions you have as we go through. Don't worry, we can't see or hear you, so don't panic about that. The session is going to be recorded and put onto the website afterwards. So if you are kind of scribbling any notes or you want to revisit anything, keep that in mind as you go through. And we've got until 1 o'clock for this meeting, but we'll see how we get on with the different time slots. But we'll aim to finish by then. For the basis and the ROSO points, if you're claiming those, please enter in the Q&A box, not the chat box, the Q&A box, your name, your basis or NAROSO number, your date of birth for NAROSO, and your postcode. We'll take all those afterwards and enter them onto the form, and the points will automatically be added to your account. So just to reiterate, put that in the Q&A box, not the chat box, otherwise everybody will see your details. So the roadshows today, we're looking at practical messages for 2022, and I'll take us through the agenda for that in a moment. But then there are two subsequent online sessions. The next one's on the 20th of January, later this week, and then one next week is the 26th of January. The 20th of January, we'll have Julian Bell looking at kind of how we're achieving net zero in arable farming. Then we've got a session which is really quite topical at the moment, looking at how we mitigate the high fertiliser prices and really understanding nitrogen use this year, given the current price of inputs. Then we've got Henry coming to talk about IPM and how it helps you make informed decisions in your farm businesses. And then we've got Jelto Zimmers. Jelto is actually joining us from Germany. He's part of an organisation called Agrimetrics, which the UK is part of. Now, this is lots of different nations inputting their production and cost of production figures into a global network. And Jelto is coming along really to show us how internationally competitive we are and what makes a competitive nation in terms of their combinable crops. So it should be a fantastic session. Then following that on the 26th, we've really got a kind of quick fire session with lots of different speakers. I won't read them all out to you, but we're really kind of covering lots of different topics there. Lots of different speakers kind of giving their input on their journey and their case studies and what they're doing. So there's plenty for all there for all different angles. A very brief AHDB update, so I won't go to impede too much on today's speakers. We've got the strategic farm in Scotland. David Aglin there on the right is our strategic farmer. We've had the 2021 results from the strategic farm. They were in November last year. That can all be found on YouTube. So going forward, though, which is the important bit, we're looking at having kind of season updates as we go through the growing season. Then there'll be an open day at the strategic farm in the summer, and then in the autumn of 2022, we'll be reporting all the results that David has in various different meeting and online formats for you to pick up that information. There's some really exciting stuff going on there, so I'd really kind of implore you to get involved with that. Wider field AHDB Scotland, you'll notice I'm from south of the border. I was actually up in Edinburgh yesterday interviewing for a knowledge exchange manager to cover Scotland. We're very hopeful that we'll be taking somebody forward. I can't obviously name anything at this stage, but we're very conscious that we need some feet on the ground in Scotland, and we've had a gap there for a couple of months now. So we're really kind of pushing that forward, and we're hoping to have some developments in the next few months to gain some coverage in the area. Then wider AHDB news, we've got the AHDB votes under the banner of Shape the Future, which is happening this spring. This is really your opportunity to input what you want AHDB to look like, and it's really kind of a once in a time opportunity for you all to go through all the AHDB tools, products and services and say which ones you value, which ones you don't, which ones you use and which ones you don't, and what you'd like to see from the organisation going forward. And it's really up to you to do this, and really up to you to kind of register and get involved with it, and then kind of be part of the journey. So the timeline for that is that the registration process is open. If you just go to the AHDB website, one of the first things you'll see is about Shape the Future and how you register and how you vote. So you can follow that. But that registration does close at the end of March, and it's really important that you do that. I've done ours at home, and this is the form here, and it takes 5 minutes to put on your information. Then when the vote opens, you get sent all the information. So really, I can't express how important it is for you all to get involved with that, to be able to use AHDB to your best advantage. Looking a bit further ahead and trying to just get it into your diaries now, Tuesday the 5th of July, Arable Scotland is planning to go ahead at Balruddery up in Dundee. It's the same partnership as previously, James Hutton, AHDB and SRUC, and I put there at the bottom some of the other supporters and sponsors of the event. So if you're sat in your office now near your calendar, please cross off 5th of July as a pivotal day for your farming calendar. So we'll go on to today's agenda. Now, there's just been a very small update to this. We're starting the day with the varietal choices with Steve, and then we're moving on to Fiona, where we're going to be discussing fungicide performance and disease management for the year. Then sadly, Julian Bell, who was supposed to be joining us, has had a family emergency, so Julian won't be joining us, and it's been happening very suddenly, so we haven't been able to kind of fill that spot yet. It will give us a bit more breathing time to ask a few more questions and for the speakers to kind of have a bit more discussion. We'll then be ending the session coming on to Paul Hargreaves and Amanda Bennett, who really can be looking at systematic approaches to soil management. And really, I did mention at the beginning, there's the Q&A box there. I'd really implore you all to use the Q&A box to ask any questions, share any experiences, or challenge us on anything that we're saying or doing in any of the presentations. So that takes me to the end of the introduction. I'll stop sharing now, and all that leaves me to do is introduce our first speaker of the day, Steve Hoad, who's part of the Crop Improvement and Agronomy team at SRUC. Steve, thank you very much for the time and effort to put this together, a tailored approach to today's Agronomy Roadshow session. And I'll hand over to you to get us underway today. Thank you, Steve.
Okay, thanks very much, Richard. I'll just get my screen up now. Looks okay. Is that okay?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Well. Thanks, Richard, and good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first of our Agronomy Roadshows. What I'd like to do today is to cover. It's a familiar theme on the variety choices. So really, it's a way for us to review the new list for Scotland. And many of our choices are also relevant for growers in the north of England, so certainly for wheat as well. So in that sort of wide context, we can think about in the first few slides how different crops have performed over years, and that really kind of sets the scene and to some extent sets the challenge for new varieties that are added to the list, particularly the diversity of our growing conditions all the way from the north of England up to the northeast of Scotland. So just in a way of outline things that we'd like to cover for you today. As I say, we'll set the scene with some information on areas and yields of the Scottish crops, so from Scottish Government data for a run of years. And then I'll review the new cereals lists and at the same time really think about why we make particular choices for the list and sort of highlight development of particular varieties and perhaps prospects for new varieties coming on board. Last year, we had quite a chat about crop resilience and the idea of introducing wider agronomic value into our new varieties and crop choices. And that continues to come through very strongly. We like to put in some new research or research updates into this session. So this year, I decided to put something in on specific weight in barley. To some extent, specific weight is still a little bit misunderstood about factors that influence it. And we've been undertaking some research in recent years on this. So as part of the spring barley section, I will say a bit about specific weights and just update you with some of the findings we found over the past few years. The two links at the bottom of this slide are really sort of the key resources on the recommended list. So the Scottish list on the first link, and then the more comprehensive UK-wide AHDB recommended lists on the bottom link. So just moving on to some context here. Here is the cereal production for Scotland. So this is Scottish government data. And it spans a large number of years here, sort of 40 years here, and the markers just indicate the 10-year spaces here. So you can see over the run of years for all cereal production, a sort of a steady increase in production, although a lot of seasonal variability. So you can see that last harvest was somewhat down on the previous two harvests, which certainly if we think back 2 years ago, all crops did well in 2019, whereas the 2020 spring barley and spring oats did particularly well. Last year, many crops were about average in terms of their long-term performance. Just on the area and the yield for all of the crops combined here, you can see that for area, we were very much around the long-term average. So 430,000 hectares for all of the Scottish cereals. And as I say, yield was down, which affected production, as you saw from the previous slide. I think the yields, we had cool, wet spring, and for some it was sort of cool, dull summer, which pulled the yields down overall. The Scottish government originally had spring barley higher than the now reported figure. So it was somewhat disappointing to see the spring barley yield fall below 6 tonnes per hectare, but I'll show you that slide in a moment. So here are the areas for the individual cereals. So last year, the spring barley, around the 250,000 hectares, wheat, sort of between 100, 110,000, which is fairly typical over recent years. We certainly need that area of wheat, and most years we are in deficit for wheat, so we certainly need that area to be nudging 110 and yields to be doing well. So winter barley, again, around about the sort of mid 40s there, and oats still looking good in terms of its area, just over 35,000 hectares. The yields, as I say, last year down on the previous 2 years. So you can see spring barley disappointed, and certainly compared to the early Scottish government's estimate that put it somewhere above 6 tonnes. So in the respect of having high yielding varieties such as Laureate and LG Diablo, it's a little disappointing to see the yields below 6 tonnes there. It may be that the high yielding varieties have actually helped at least maintain it at the long-term average rather than being much lower. Wheat, they're around about the long-term average, but for our own local supply, we do need to be getting yields towards 9 tonnes or over for the average. So winter barley also around about average, and oats a little bit down on the previous 2 years. And then just finishing off with the production figures here. So you can see that most years we're between 1.4 to about 1.7, 1.8. And certainly for comfort within the barley sector, for malting, for straw, for feed, we do really need to be around about 1.6 for more comfort to supply all of our main markets. And as I suggested, that winter wheat, we're often in deficit for wheat. So we really do need to be nudging 1 million tonnes or just over to satisfy all our local needs. I think it's encouraging that the oats remains relatively high, and it'd be nice to see that trend continuing. So that's kind of set the scene in a way, raising the yields. Certainly, we're not going to have huge changes in terms of the amount of area that we can use for our major crops. So the key to increasing production with sustained quality is to raise the yields. So it's in this context then that I can introduce the new Scottish variety lists. And you're now familiar with the way that we put this together, the way we try to guide on whether the particular traits, yield, and all the agronomic features are relatively good or relatively poor compared to standards, compared to controls, or I think increasingly compared to expectation, really, and target. So when we're putting the list together, the Scottish list is a shorter version of the UK list. Here we are including information and testing information from different end users. And we're thinking also about where varieties might have a particular specific or special use as well. And the final 2 bullets here, I think or aspects that are increasingly important in terms of the way we think about varieties. And it's really about resilience in production, and that's really related to the farming business and the crop rotation. So increasingly, we're making decisions. Our decisions aren't rule-based. We don't have thresholds, but we choose varieties on strengths for the growing system and the farming business. So I think that's a way to look at this list, which means it's slightly different from the way that varieties are recommended for the wider UK recommended list system. And I think certainly when it comes to improvements, genetic improvement and improvement in the testing system, we're going to be embracing this wider agronomic value along with features such as quality and yield stability. So I'll get on to review the lists now, starting with spring barley. So this is the position from the Malting Barley Committee. So do look at the MAG Malting Barley Committee website. It's a wealth of information there, including the wish list from the maltsters, but also the position of the favoured varieties. So I've just put into context here for the Scottish industries by indicating the fully approved varieties that go in for malt distilling and brewing or grain distilling. There are other varieties such as RGT Planet, which is fully approved for brewing. And then we've also got varieties such as Splendor and Skyway that are provisionally approved also for brewing. But we start with Laureate, was the dominant variety last harvest, so remains dominant, had about 62% of the Scottish intake and over half of the UK intake for its different uses. This variety was supported by KWS Sassy, which had about 15% of the Scottish intake, and Diablo at 17%. I think the longer term success of Diablo is going to be linked to the way it develops in Scotland and in England for its dual purpose uses. So we'd certainly like to see that continue to support the market leader at Laureate and certainly hopefully grow its share in the coming year. Fairing remains the only fully approved variety for the grain distilling sector, so the high nitrogen sector. I've got here two other varieties that are provisionally approved by the Malting Barley Committee. Now, both SY Tungsten and Firefox are what we call provisional approval stage 2. So that means they've got one more chance to gain full approval and then be added to the top part of the list. And we'll get information on that this spring. So for the Scottish list, we've actually got these on what we call provisional year 3. And that really indicates that we're still waiting for that final industry guidance or approval before giving a full recommendation on the Scottish list. So I'm hoping both make it towards full approval. And I've just indicated some of the grain quality features there that I think are going to be valuable for us, for our uses in Scotland. So we're very good malt extract and particularly spirit yield for tungsten. Both varieties characterised by low grain nitrogen, which is key for us, good grain size, and in particular Firefox has a relatively low level of grain skinning. So I think both varieties have value and certainly on the context of yield as well. I'm hopeful that these will make progress a bit later in the year. So just going through the tables that I've extracted from the Scottish list here. So you can see the main malting varieties in the list here. So you can see the position of tungsten and Firefox in terms of their treated yield compared to the control varieties. And then we've got in the next column, the yield loss if untreated. Okay, so in spring barley, that's still relatively small percentage compared to their winter counterparts. Okay, but certainly follow what Fiona is guiding later on in terms of protecting that yield, which also influences protection of quality in spring crops, but particularly the winter crops. And for completeness in this table, I've indicated the position of the varieties in terms of their market use. Okay, so tungsten and Firefox with their provisional status there. So if we're moving on to quality and agronomic features here, you can see that for grain size and screenings, most of the varieties, our preferred varieties, are relatively good or good. Specific weights tend to be around about average. Sassy and Fairing, particularly good, relatively high there, and there's a spread of maturity dates across these varieties. The early variety Fairing, that's very useful in some locations, that -2. But as I say, Fairing is really a grain distilling variety, or could be a general purpose variety, perhaps in feed areas, although it is slightly lower yielding. Some variation in straw strength, but unless we're on fairly fertile lands, lodging in spring barley in Scotland is fairly low. Okay, but there is a little bit of variation there in terms of the straw strength characteristic. I'll say a little bit more about specific weights in some more dedicated slides in a moment. Just finishing the agronomic features for the main varieties here. So you can see overall strength in terms of good resistance to brackling. Sassy a little bit weaker. on disease resistance, yes, certainly scope for improvement there against Rincosporium. Okay, so I'd really like to see a lot more 6s and 7s coming through in terms of Rincosporium resistance. So, so look out for that as a major disease to control. So just moving on now to the other varieties on the list, so brewing and feed use. So I've mentioned Planet, Splendor and Skyway a moment ago. So here's their yields and their position for the particular markets there. So you can see that Splendor, like Tungsten and Firefox, we've kept that, but as P3 rather than recommended, because we're still waiting to see whether that can make stronger progress and recommendation, full approval from the MBC. Okay, and then there's one out-and-out feed variety prospect. Okay, so we've not included other feed varieties because we think for Scottish growers we can make good use of the high yielding malting varieties for that particular purpose. Okay, so prospect again, we've held that at P3, and it has a place, fairly good agronomic features. So going through just to complete the story for the other varieties, so you can see certainly for the brewing varieties, good or towards good in terms of grain quality. Prospect also around about average. And you can see a little bit of variation there in maturity. Skyway and Planet being relatively early. So now I'm going to say a little bit more about specific weights in barley, and as I kind of alluded before, that's perhaps a little bit still kind of misunderstood, and the relationship with other characteristics such as average grain weight or 1,000 grain weight. But here is some specific weights, the indication of what the measure is all about. So a measure of quality, it's weight or mass per unit volume. There are industry standards, and there can be minimum standards that need to be met for different sectors across all the cereal sectors. But what we wanted to do was to think a little bit deeper and think about how specific weight related to other measures of grain quality, but also think about its value in processing. So we could extend this, for example, to milling in wheat or to malting in barley. So today I'm just going to focus on barley and just to highlight some of the ways we're beginning to look at this. So factors that influence specific weights. So they're very wide, and we can think of the inherent variety differences themselves. We can think of environmental impacts, so seasonal impacts on the way that the grain develops and fills towards achieving its specific weight. We can think of the way that agronomy and particularly handling might influence specific weight. So some of the images there that I've sourced from the AHDB website, you can see how some of the other grain characteristics might also be changing with season, with growing conditions, and also impact on specific weight. So the way that the grain is handled, for example, or combines as well, can actually affect specific weights if the crop, particularly barley, is too orny. Okay, so we'll reduce the specific weight. And certainly weathering, our often long protracted sort of harvesting conditions can sometimes alter the surface properties of grains, and that impacts on the way grains flow within the bulk and can reduce specific weight. So this is really highlighting the work that one of my PhD students, Aaron Hoyle, covered over the past few years. So looking at specific weights as several different components. So we've got the packing efficiency, so the way individual grains pack within the bulk. So that's influenced by size, shape, and things like the presence of the awns or not. But there's also another feature, which is the individual grain density. So that's somewhat influenced by its chemical and sort of physical composition. Okay, and then along with, as I say, things like grain dimensions and composition at a cellular level. So if we're looking at the relationship between packing efficiency and grain density, if we multiply these two things together, we actually get a very good indication of the actual specific weight. So you can see here for a number of varieties. So this is from Aaron's work. So for a number of varieties, you can see the spread in specific weight and how the packing efficiency times density there on this axis, on the lower axis there, how that those together correlate with specific weight. Okay, and what Aaron found was that the packing efficiency and the grain density contributed a high proportion of that variation in specific weight. When we see sienna here, so we've known that that's in a variety with very high specific weights, that's partly due to having a high grain density. So individual grains contributing to that particular high level within the feature. So if we take this a bit further, we can actually look at grain density. So this is a graph where we've got 6 varieties. The varieties are shown on the previous graphs, and the bulks have been separated into 5 density classes. And then we've looked at the relationship between density and, in this case, grain nitrogen concentration or content. So you can see that there is a positive sort of association between density and nitrogen content. Now that might have a consequence if grain density was too high. So for malt distilling, that could push the grain nitrogen content above the desired level. So that's something that was quite new in the way what we've discovered about specific weight. So in that sense, we're probably thinking that the very high specific weights, if that relates to changes in nitrogen content as well, then that's probably undesirable for the malt distilling sector. It might be useful for milling in wheat, for example, but less so for malt distilling. Yeah, so nitrogen content explained quite a high proportion of the variation in grain density. If we just take this further into perhaps a wider context here. So each of these data points here is for a candidate variety coming through evaluation. So these are analyses that come from micromalting tests. And here I've got 1,000 grain weight and specific weight on the 2 axes here. And it's just reinforcing the message that specific weight and 1,000 grain weight often do not correlate. So they're really quite different measures. Okay, so just bearing that in mind, that specific weight is comprised of a lot more influencing factors than grain size or grain weight alone. Okay, the 2 varieties here with the relatively high specific weight, they happen also to have a relatively high grain nitrogen content. So it's kind of supporting that earlier work that Aaron undertook, that some of the variation in this sort of cloud of data can be explained by changes in other features. We just take this further and then begin to think about what change in specific weight might mean for processing. So in this case, this is hot water extract. Again, we can see it's a bit of a cloud here. So there's no sort of clear pattern or clear trend. But one thing is apparent here, that when we get to this high end in specific weight, where we're often thinking of grains that are perhaps around average size or a bit smaller in size or higher in nitrogen content. And then the 2 samples here up the top, the 2 candidates up here at the top, that high extract, we associated that during the micromalting process with relatively high levels of grain skinning. So that can sometimes perhaps give a false analysis of the amount of extract because of that high level of husk loss or grain skinning. Okay, so like the previous figure, there's quite a lot more we can tease out from these kinds of associations to get a complete understanding of the value for specific weight. And the way we're doing this is to look at relationships between different measures. So specific weight and grain nitrogen here. So following up from Aaron's earlier work, and you can see that certainly the specific weights, the higher level, they were relatively high in their grain nitrogen. And certainly in micromorting tests, we do have to be careful that where we have variation in grain skinning, there is this weak trend, so that the higher extract type of varieties could have a relatively high husk loss or grain skinning. So we do need to take that into account when we're evaluating varieties. So just as a summary there on specific weight, so it's a balance of a number of features with a whole variety of influencing factors on each of them. We do believe that there is significant economic impact that depends on the relative values of packing efficiency, grain density, and composition, such as nitrogen. And what we're trying to do next is to work towards what we consider to be optimal values in terms of processing quality and efficiency. And as I say, perhaps for spring barley, we want high, but not too high specific weights for malt distilling purposes. Okay, so I've taken my time on that because I know we've got a little bit more time this morning with Julian unable to join us. But what I'll do now, I'll complete the review of the other cereals on the recommended list. So in terms of oats here, we've got the market leaders, Canyon, Conway. Those are the main varieties. That's a typo there. WPB Elian, I would say, is a supporting variety along with Isabel. Okay, so we've got a reasonably good choice, and certainly in terms of quality, I think Isabel looks a very promising variety. So I think we've got range there to choose from for our main intakes of spring oats. And there's a new variety there called Merlin. And I'll just show the summary data for you there. So the strength of the varieties such as Isabel in terms of yield, but also good specific weights and low level of screenings and a pretty healthy kernel content as well. So you can see certainly for the newer variety Merlin there looks very encouraging in terms of its agronomic yield, a bit lower in the kernel content, but do discuss the particular varieties with your end user to check out for particular preferences. But overall, I think it's a very good collection of varieties for Scottish uses. Coming on to spring wheat here, the spring wheat list has certainly grown now with more choice. In terms of area, it's not such a major crop, but I think it's useful to be able to have spring or alternatives, so other crops that we might be able to place within the crop rotation. So we've got the main choices: Malika, Cochise, Giraffe, Talisker and Escape, two feed choices there, and then two new varieties, one a feed variety and one a high quality milling variety added to the list. So here I'll show you the complete list here in terms of the yield improvements there. You can see there's often, as with winter wheats, there's often a yield penalty in terms of the quality wheats, the nabbing 1s and 2s, being lower in agronomic yield. But you can see the range there in terms of yield, and an overall pretty good quality in terms of the Hagberg falling number and specific weight. So I think there's a lot of scope there for making choices among these varieties for your crop rotation. Please look at the recommended list for more information, the agronomic information about the individual varieties. Just coming now onto winter barley. So I'll show you the varieties from the complete list in a moment. So as I said last year, we've got plenty of choice now in 2-row feed and 6-row hybrids. I suppose what I'd like to see is perhaps more conventional 6 rows, adding to the choices. But certainly with yield improvements in 2 rows, I think that sector looks really quite exciting, and certainly 2 new entries for this year. We've got Lightning and LG Dazzle, and then 2 new 6-row feed varieties, FAS and SY Canyon. So I think it's a good time to dip into the choice among these varieties to suit your growing conditions and quality needs. So here's the list for the 2-row feed varieties here. So you can see we've got a sprinkling of relatively new varieties at the top end of the yield level there. And thinking back to what I said about yield loss in the untreated situation in spring barley, you can see there's quite a jump here. There's quite a lot of yield to protect when it comes to the winter crop. So do bear that in mind when we're making choices. So the market leader in recent years has been Mountain. We've dropped a lot of the familiar names such as Cresswell and Tower, and you can see that we really want you to think about taking advantage of these varieties at P1 and P2. Here are the agronomic features here, so the quality and agronomic features. So certainly a good range there, healthy range of specific weights and relatively low levels of screenings. Just small differences in maturity there. The crop, certainly looking at trials, they are fairly similar in terms of that particular characteristic, and there is some variation in straw strength. So TARDIS would seem to be a good option if you're after a particularly stiff-strawed, good specific weight option. And just on diseases here, quite a lot of oranges and reds here, so towards poor or poor. So again, you can see where that untreated yield loss, where that comes from in terms of these relatively poor yield resistance ratings. So that's something to bear in mind as you match Fiona's advice with variety choice for next autumn's sowings. Just on the 6-row feed varieties here. So the first 2 are the conventional 6-row varieties. You'll see there a new variety, KWS Ferris here. This one is a specific recommendation on the list for tolerance to BYDV. So it's not so competitive against other 6 rows in terms of its treated yield, but that particular feature allowed this variety to be added to the AHDB list, and we thought we would position it as well in the Scottish list. So look a bit more closely at that variety for its agronomic features to see whether it suits the rotation on your farm. Then below that, we've got the 6-row hybrids, again, all from the same breeder. You can see the very high yields here. And again, think about the crop protection in terms of protecting that yield, but also for the straw stiffness control, because these very high yielding crops cannot be often under high lodging pressure. And just completing here some of the agronomic features for the varieties. compared to years ago, the specific weights of 6 rows is really quite outstanding now, and I think that's it's a real testament to the bringing the yield and specific weight together by the breeder here. Okay, so look at these quality features along with yield, and as I said before, there's plenty of choice here and I think we're in a good position in terms of the winter barley crop. And just on the diseases here for completeness for the 6 rows, again, tendency in many towards poor, but compared to 2 rows, that we're probably in a better state of health in terms of the disease resistances being slightly more lifted compared to some of the 2-row varieties. Right, so I'm just going to now finish with the wheat variety update. So we've got quite a long list this year. 6 new varieties being added to the list. We dropped 4, but I think the list is about 20 now, which is quite long for us. So in terms of soft feed and distilling, 2 new varieties, RGT Stokes and RGT Bairstow. We've got biscuits and distilling, KWS Brium, new variety there. We've added 2 of the new hard feed wheats because we think the agronomics and yield will have value within the Scottish rotation, and also included hard milling wheat. Again, thinking of a more complete agronomic package. Although this won't go for distilling, it has a combination of agronomic features that we think could be a guide to direction in future wheats in general. Just starting with the soft feed and distilling wheats, showing the position of Stokes and Bairstow there at the top of the treated yields there compared to the control. And then you can see the position there of the market leaders, that's Skyscraper, Elation, and Jackal there. Okay, so some yield improvement there in trials, and note the variation in the yield loss if untreated. So that it does highlight the need for care in some of the dirtier varieties. The way we're choosing varieties now, certainly for the Scottish list, a large number of them, of our preferred varieties, are looking good as a second cereal. So that's, I think that is that is helpful within our crop rotation. And you can see the last column, the columns in this slide indicate the market qualities, and certainly both Stokes and Bairstow have come through the SWRI tests with flying colours, so they're consistent in terms of their spirit yield and their processing efficiency. So that's really quite positive for those two varieties in terms of yield and quality for the distilling sector. Agronomic features here for the same varieties. So you can see variation in specific weight and Hagberg falling number. Once we get into the oranges sort of towards poor there for Hagberg falling number, that can have a link with lower sprouting resistance. You can see Spotlight there, so relatively high Hagberg, and it's got above average sprouting resistance. So do note that if there is a risk, then try to go for a variety that's got a higher Hagberg or sprouting resistance. Some variation also in the straw strength here. So you can see with and without the plant growth regulator applied. So again, with choice for this sector, you can look at all of these features as a package and pick out the priority traits for your farm. And just finishing with disease resistance here. So you can see, as with the winter barley 2 rows, there's quite a lot of scope for yield improvement. The yellow rust there, put an asterisk there, that uses a weighted evaluation now for yellow rust, weighting the most recent year. And Septoria triticide now produced in two forms, one for the 3-year average and one for the most recent year. And I've actually used the most recent year, which tends to bring the rating down a bit. So I think it's a better indication of risk among the varieties. So it really is important to take care and look at the treatment of these varieties for the Septoria triticide, which really is kind of, I suppose, it's regarded as sort of a chronic condition for this particular crop. And just finishing with the biscuit and or distilling options here, the new variety Cadia Breum here, sort of in the middle of the pack, that there in terms of sort of yield and quality features. All of the varieties suit biscuit making. Barrel is poor for distilling, and it's really getting close to being outclassed, I think, now, particularly because of that very high untreated yield as well. Okay. And just for completeness here, I've not gone through all of the agronomic features for these other varieties, but I'm just going to show this this slide for the other varieties. So including the two milling wheats here, Extase and Palladium, and then the out-and-out feed varieties here in the upper part of the list. So you can see that Dorsum and to some extent Typhoon offer some decent yields, but also relatively low yield loss if untreated. So compared to some of the other varieties like Inciter and Gleam, that's looking a really good direction for wheat. So hopefully that sort of development can be transferred into our favoured wheat, soft wheat varieties in future. Got a note against Extase here. In certainly at more exposed sites and more northerly sites, it can be more susceptible to seed set problems. So it's a variety where that particular issue is not crucial. Okay, so it's something that's a bit more selective in where that is grown. So just final thoughts, really. Think about the complete package of all features along with yield. Think about the quality measures as well as the wider agronomic value, whether it's disease resistance, maturity, or other features such as straw stiffness. So I think that's going to be increasingly important in getting this kind of balanced view of which varieties should be on the recommended list. And certainly for a long-term strategy, we're going to be talking a lot more about stability, consistency, resilience as perhaps becoming more important than out-and-out yield. Quality will always remain important, but it's consistency that increasingly so. Check the new varieties to support the market leaders. Certainly, we've got yield improvements. There's plenty of options. Winter wheat, winter barley for our main markets. And to a large extent, we've got options in spring oats and spring wheat. And I think in spring barley, I'd like to see people given a chance to test out tungsten and firefox as supporting varieties, because certainly we haven't got new varieties coming through, certainly to be in the same position as tungsten and firefox for about another 3 or 4 years. So it'd be quite nice to see these varieties being evaluated on farm as well as gaining progress in the testing system and at a commercial level. And as I say, I think we're beginning to think of varieties much more in terms of a more complete package of traits for matching your farming business and contributing to improved performance on farm. So thank you very much, and I'll hand back to Richard for now.
Brilliant, thank you, Steve. It's brilliant to see such a wide-ranging amount of information packaged like that and tailored towards the audience today. I've just got a few questions, if you don't mind, if I quickly put it as we're going to go from one speaker to the other. Steve, uneven grain sizes will pack better than homogeneous grain sizes, so crop unevenness or blends should have higher specific weights. Is this a problem?
No, it's a really interesting question, because we actually when we started the project, we asked a lot of people about this particular issue, because it extends to much wider than agriculture. It's about how materials pack, and so you could, if you've got the right composition, have different grain sizes and shape that might optimize, say, a packing efficiency. But certainly we found that if you get the shape right, and size right, then a uniform bulk will pack well. So for example, Sienna had excellent packing efficiency, as well as that relatively high grain density that I alluded to. So I suppose when it comes to things like blends, variety blends, I think that was what's behind the question. There, I suppose we've got lots of things varying at any one time. So again, the message might not be so simple as having, say, choosing 3 or 4 particular varieties. So I think where we look at certainly wheat varieties like Leeds, for example, that maintained excellent specific weight across the years, and other varieties that we showed in spring barley, we do have varieties that are consistently good, and it relates to those sort of 2 packing and density features.
Thank you, Steve. LG Mountain has been very inconsistent in real life in both yield and quality over the last couple of years. Has this shown in trials as well?
Well, that's interesting to get that, because it's in trials it's looked pretty good, and certainly just looking at the yield and the specific weight here. So it's actually been good under the trials conditions. So it would be good to get a bit more feedback, perhaps on the growing conditions, the sowing and the harvesting conditions, so that we can perhaps identify where varieties perhaps reach a certain point where they start to perhaps underperform in terms of some of their reported trials features. But certainly in trials, it's looked pretty good over the years, and certainly in terms of the area of the seed crop, the industry's been encouraged to keep maintaining this particular variety. But certainly, if there is any kind of local opinion, we'd really appreciate getting that for mountain or other varieties.
Thank you, Steve. One last one before we go over to Fiona. Are Stokes and Bairstow okay in an early sowing situation?
At the moment, the data is quite short in terms of the number of years we've got to test the varieties. So at the moment, I wouldn't position them in the very early sowing slot. I would hold off until we get a little bit more information on those. But what we'll try to do is to get information on that ready for the coming autumn. So what we'll try to do is to update that list with perhaps a top 3 or 4 for early drilling for this coming autumn. So we'll have discussions over the coming weeks and months so that we can get that ready for people come September. Okay.
Brilliant. Thank you, Steve. Thank you to the questions. This is the session I was most worried about, because I'm not local, that I didn't know any of the varieties off from my own experience. So thank you to the attendees. We'll segue straight over into Fiona Burnett now. So if I invite Fiona onto the virtual stage. Fiona is a professor in applied plant pathology at SRUC, and also the head of knowledge exchange at SRUC. And we're very honoured to have her here today, sharing a kind of a session on how we design a fungicide program for this coming crop of harvest 2022. Thank you very much, Fiona, and I'll hand the stage to you.
Hello.
Ooh, that's better.
Is that me coming through now, Richard? Sorry, I must have leant on the mute button. Yeah. Anyway, you missed. I wasn't going to attempt to take over Julian's joke slot, so You've missed my painful introduction there. But yeah, just to welcome everybody to this roadshow and wish you a happy new year if it's not too late. So moving on from what Steve has been introducing there, clearly the varietal choice is very important. So I'll be trying to go through the fungicide performance, in some depth, the kind of technical performance of the fungicides we have available, but then trying to pull out the key messages in terms of how we develop strategies for this coming year. And really, if we start to think about what our main disease risks are, the technical efficiency of those products, and then begin to think about where we can use new and existing chemistry. And I want to spend a little bit of time talking about ramularia. We had a particular ramularia year last year, and it remains a difficult one for us to give advice on. And to be frank, the results from the fungicide trials are fairly mixed. So I hope we can have an interesting discussion on that point. Steve's introduced the kind of varietal weaknesses that we have in terms of disease, but clearly our other major driver is weather, and you don't need me to tell you kind of just what a mild back end in winter we've had. I've picked out a few of the Met Office charts for you here. So we've got that anomaly for the winter temperatures, and you can see, again, we're at least a degree higher than the normal autumn. And the upside of that is just how well our winter crops are looking, well established and very advanced and very even. Air frost is clearly another driver of, what might nip disease in the bud. And again, you can see there the days of air frost, the anomaly from what is normal. And if you look at the main cropping areas, so across the central belt, up the east coast and round the edges there, again, you can see that we have fewer frosts that kind of nip disease in the bud. So clearly, the upside is we've got great looking crops in the ground. The downside is, that we're seeing disease already creep into crops. So, for example, we've got mildew in the winter barley at our Lanark site. We're seeing septoria creeping into some of the wheat trials. And we have light leaf spot coming into the Aussie drape trials that we've got. So that clearly starts to drive your early T-naught decision-making thinking. And it's not inevitable that all our crops get T-naughts. It should still be based on the, what you're seeing as your walking crops. But that kind of, I think what we're really picking out, where normally sow date is a very strong driver of the amount of disease that you'll see in crops. At the minute, because the autumn's been so mild, it's actually even some of the later sown crops have some disease sitting there already. So keep an eye on that one. I'll start to go through the results from last year. So just to give you a little bit of context about what last season was like when we're interpreting those results. Again, we got locked into a kind of odd spring with a prolonged dry period. And again, slightly warmer than the norm. So, particularly that kind of stem extension period in April and May was dry and really kind of knocked disease back. We then moved into a fairly wet period in late May, which fueled disease up. But again, we got caught in a kind of position where it seemed sensible to economize on T1 inputs, and then disease appeared by late flag leaf timings. And that chart here just illustrates that kind of drier than average and lack of rainfall, particularly in our arable areas. So if I just hop straight into the fungicide performance charts. So starting with septoria in wheat, which, clearly it's the main target of our wheat programs. So looking at a good number of trials here in an over-year analysis of septoria protection. And, it's not a new message that protection's where we need to be at for septoria. So just to pick out where we can, sorry, I've got a strange message on my screen, so my little arrow's not working. If we could look at the the Arizona there, which appears in trials now. We used to have Bravo in the fungicide performance trials just to mark that the trials were protectant and to see the efficacy of that product. You can see where Arizona's sitting. So it's bringing about 50% reduction there. So that is not nothing and gives quite a strong message around using full pit as a protectant and to support the other products. But you see how relatively it sits compared to other products that we had in trial. So the two that we're comparing there, you can see Univoc and Revastar as the newer products that we have in trials. So Univoc being an Inatrec prothioconazole mix, and Revastar obviously being that newer azole, again in mixture with an SDHI, and Ascra X-Pro being the kind of best of the rest, if you like, in terms of a more established product. And quite nicely, those two new products, the Revastar and Univoc, are running, exactly on top of each other. So very similar performance in this robust trial series. On the right-hand side of the chart there, you can see where the straight products sit. So you see Proline as a long-term standard, and you see Imtrex. And again, the message there is you see the clear advantage of the mixed products in trial there. If we move to an eradicant situation for the same trial series, you immediately see those lines pop up from that corner where we want the lines to be. So good control at low doses. Here you've seen them move away from that corner. But, again, the Revastar and the Univoc sitting very close together and just ahead of the Ascra. And you see, again, how the straight products are toiling in that situation. Now, clearly, nobody's using them as straight products, but it gives you a good measure of the improvement of those mixed products. And then crucially looking at the yields there, so you see the advantages of the newer products. And again, in terms of developing programs, that does tend to steer me at least towards placing them at the most responsive timings, which clearly will be that flag leaf timing. And again, you see some yield benefit there from Arizona, which is commensurate with the price of it in programs. So it's bringing a larger benefit there than the cost of use. Now, I talk a lot about the issues we have with resistance development. So here you see the azole activity over the years, and we're looking in particular at prothioconazole over that long run of timings. And what you see there is, that last year, that long-term issue that we've had with azole efficacy in trials continues. So we've dropped from around 80% to control to around this kind of somewhere between the 40 and the 20% control. What you see by introducing the new azole as included in Revastar is that kind of restoration in efficacy. So we're back up to kind of 80% control from a straight azole there. So that's encouraging, but it doesn't mean that we would expect that encouraging red dot to remain at that 80% level. We've seen this history with azoles in the past where the decline kind of moves on year. Also to flag that the SDHIs, we knew they were a kind of moderately at risk group of chemistry when they came onto the market. And we see the kind of gradual widening of the kind of variability that we get with SDHI products. So this chart series is showing you the dark line is the average control in the fungicide performance trials versus the best control and the worst control seen in trials. So back in 2016, you see that kind of range of efficacy. So again, we're at full doses hovering around that 80% for the average. But you see that kind of gradual toppling in the chart and the widening. So the worst case scenarios, kind of the control becomes poorer. And that continues into 2021. So you see really quite a broad range of control in the trials last year. But there is a more encouraging message there. So we see that restoration and efficacy where you use those mixed products. So a really strong piece here about just using balanced mixtures of the STHIs or the newer Inatrek Univoc products, where again, if we look at the average and the best and the worst control, we're back up to very encouraging levels of control for these newer products. And again, we've got ASCRA on this chart as well. So I think that, yeah, it gives a more realistic message to the kind of the weaknesses of using straight products where we know we have emerging and ongoing issues with resistance. So yellow rust, Steve alluded to that, and clearly we have issues in identifying varieties that are robustly resistant to yellow rust and some variability between the sites. So this really is one that, again, we're walking crops for at the moment, and checking particularly on the kind of coastal regions where yellow rust is first to emerge, what the status of your crops is. The good news in terms of managing with fungicides is that we have a good number of products that give us very effective control. So here you're seeing the newer products, the Revastar and the Univoc, and we're seeing a Lataceras. So maybe not the strongest of products when it comes to Septoria, although the control is good. It really has a position where yellow rust is the issue. And then here we have all the straight products, so lots of choice here. Pectiga is the straight form of Inatrek. Myrisa is a straight form of Revasol, so the azole working alone there, and we've got Proline and we've got Imtrex. So many of those lines sitting more or less on top of each other. So in terms of managing rust, certainly protectantly, we've got the chemical armory to do it. I'm just going to pop this longer term yellow rust series up now, just to bring in a few of the products that have been in slightly longer term. So Comet, don't forget about the strobilurins for early yellow rust support. They bring good control, and they maybe bring a bit of relief to some of those T0 and early decisions. So I think, increasingly where we're struggling to support early T0 inputs in terms of being reliant on azoles, adding a strobilurin in there for you. Again, you can see, Latacera definitely has a position here, and you see how the newer products, Univoc and Revastar, are sitting in terms of yellow rust control. So all that's very acceptable in terms of yield responses. And again, you see where some of the other products are sitting, particularly the straight products there. So I just wanted to move onwards from those fungicide performance charts and to think about how we would start to design wheat programs. So thinking of some of the trial results that we had out there last year. This is a wheat trial from our site out at Humby in East Lothian. And what we were trying here was some fairly typical, if you like, programs. So we had an untreated trial. So, actually, quite encouraging yield responses there, 8.4 tonnes from an untreated wheat crop. So reflecting the fact that disease came in late, and of course, East Lothian's naturally one of our high yielding areas. And then the standard programs here. So Proline at a high rate at T1, and then ASCRA at T2 as our kind of starter program. And then we were adding in Fulpit either at T1 or T2, or at both T1 and T2. So if we look at the yields for that, you can see that the yield response, we've had a nice yield response here from a conventional program. So we've lifted the yield from 8.4 to 9.3 tonnes. An increase here from having Arizona in at the T1 timing. So we're up to 9.5 tonnes in that situation. So you would expect Fulpit to work well in that protectant situation. Adding it in only at the T2 timing, you can see hasn't been a particularly successful approach. Having it in at T1 and T2 lifts us statistically back into this zone. And again, I come back to the point of supporting the chemistry that we're using. So we have the ability to use full put twice in a program, and that this sort of T1 and T2 approach seems sensible. If you're only going to do it once, then clearly working where it will be at its best in a protectant situation at T1 is sensible. And again, we've talked about this before, but you know, the aim of what we're trying to do, both in terms of maximizing the margins for you and supporting the chemistry and not kind of accelerating resistance risks, is to use the minimum number of applications and, where we can, the minimum dose. So really trying not to expose our chemistry any more than we have to. That, like I say, should bring you win-wins in terms of margins. It ticks IPM boxes, but it also helped us for resistance issues. So coming back to that T0 decision, ideally for wheats, it's really only about early rust protection if and where you need it, based on what you're seeing when you're walking crops. This T1 timing remains really important. And, you know, Steve, in highlighting some of the varieties for you there, you may have noticed, you know, there's a kind of generic weakness now for eye spot. And we have few varieties that are properly resilient for septoria. So that's a very important protectant timing. And we would certainly be thinking about adding in full pit in whatever form it, you know, it may be Arizona that you're using. The T1.5s should really only be in emergencies and where things have fallen apart for other reasons, and not part of your planned approach for how you would organise a programme. T2, I mean, that is just the most responsive timing. It's where I think we should be using some of that newer chemistry. And by using some of that newer chemistry, we're giving a chance to perhaps at least alternate the azoles and potentially alternate the Inatrec in place of the SDHIs. And the T3 remains really crucial for us in terms of protecting against head diseases, microtochium, and continued green leaf and septoria protection. We are azole reliant at that timing, and we could perhaps think about some of the alternative multi-sites there, and that's perhaps something to bring up in the discussion session. So yeah, just a few sort of summary messages there about the wheat fungicide programs. Maximising that dose of Arizona, splitting the doses where possible. So we have this sort of slight conundrum that you can use it twice at 1.5 litres or 3 times at 1 litre. I think certainly splitting it and, you know, supporting the other chemistry where you can is a sensible and kind of resilient approach. I think the data really speaks for itself in terms of the advantages of using those balanced mixtures of systemics and azoles. So that's a kind of sensible approach, and probably where you're all at anyway. Trying to limit the dose and application number of individual actives where you can, ticks so many boxes, and tuning those doses and the actives to the risk that you're seeing. So, you know, last year, absolutely, in the face of a dry season, it was sensible to reduce dose and actives, but, you know, well, certainly sensible to reduce doses. I think keeping the number of actives up is, again, a sensible approach. So reinforcing that message about mixtures. Targeting, you know, what you're using to the most effective products and responsive timings, I think, is absolutely self-evident. And I do think, you know, the new chemistry, as I say, gives a chance to alternate azoles where you're using Revastar and alternating in with prothioconazole, and Inatrec at T2 gives us that option to alternate with an SDHI. If we start to think about the winter barley crop, the early disease there last season was again, it was really checked by the dry spring. In the trials, though, we did see quite high levels of Rhynchosporium, and that control at T1 was really important. And I think that's the position we're going to be in again this year with the mild conditions that we've had. So the winter barley crops, you know, probably are at some risk of early disease. And we're seeing kind of increasing issues with net blotch as well. Here you see an illustration of yellow rust in our trial site at Bog Hall. So it's not particularly common in commercial sites, but it's another one that's exacerbated by warm conditions and one to be watching out of. We do see quite a bit of brown rust now in barley crops as well. So yeah, disease came late into crops. We've got a sort of grisly array of pictures there illustrating what we were managing in the trials last year. And like I say, I will spend a bit of time on ramularia, particularly when we get to the spring crop, because that remains a problem issue for us. So thinking about Rhynchosporium as the kind of key issue that we're trying to manage in the winter barley trials, here we're comparing Revastar as a newer offering in barley against the standard Proline and Imtrex, and you see here again, in an eradicant situation, the same range of products. So again, a sort of similar message that protectant is where we want to be at. And again, that's what we're trying to do in our T1 timings on your winter barley crops. Thinking about net blotch, I mean, net blotch is another example of a pathogen where we've got emerging issues with strobilurins, with SDHIs, and with azoles when it comes to resistance. So not full-blown resistance, but just that kind of erosion of individual efficacies. So here you can see the kind of efficacy in a protectant situation from Imtrex and Proline. We tried Kayak to bring a bit of variety into the trials, but you can see that Cyprodinol's strong sweet is not going to be net blotch. And again, you see the eradicant activity there, bringing in Revastar to the eradicant control there. So we do have choices when it comes to net blotch management. The one to flag is maybe bringing in, we've had Ascra in trials, and Siltra has been our long-term standard in the winter barley trials. So what I've done here is pick out some of the trials where Siltra has been a particular standard and where we've had Ascra in the same trial series. And you can see that for Rhynchosporium, Ascra, which obviously brings an additional SDHI active and a slightly higher SDHI loading, is bringing some advantage in terms of efficacy. And then we have the yield advantage sitting with Ascra as well. A slightly greater advantage when we come to net blotch control. So here you see the Ascra, the extra SDHI loading, pulling ahead of the Siltra standard. And again, it's coming through certainly in the doses that you would be using up to full dose here. The Ascra is pulling ahead as well. And like I say, that's probably reflecting the erosion in efficacy in the SDHIs, which we see coming through in terms of the net blotch mutations that are now relatively common. So now getting on to our problem trialed ramularia. So you can see where we're at in terms of the available fungicide efficacy when it comes to managing ramularia. So Proline has been our long-term standard for managing ramularia. It's still bringing something to the party. So around, at the full dose here, we're just shy of 50% control of ramularia. The Myrisa is the straight azole in Revastar. So you see the advantage to that azole. Oops, apologies. And you also see how close that is to the Revastar line. So that's really reflecting what we know about ramularia, in that the resistance to the SDHI components is fairly complete. So SDHIs as such are not bringing a huge amount in terms of ramularia control. They may help de-stress the crop, and they obviously help in managing the wider portfolio of diseases that you'll be looking at. But their efficacy against ramularia per se is probably fairly minimal. So that's kind of where we're at. Many of you will remember that when we tried Fulpit in the fungicide performance trials, its efficacy was was poor, so it basically used alone gave us a fairly flat line and fairly little in the way of efficacy. But it remains a kind of an interesting discussion point, how we will use full put in trials. And, you know, here I'm showing you a trial series that we had at Bog Hall last year, where we were trying, you know, a huge range of products to try and manage the Ramularia that we had at the site. So I think in common with many of you, this trial site was fairly typical. The Ramularia came in relatively late, but we had about a fortnight before the crop died off where it was problematic. So here you see a completely untreated control, but we also have what really is the matched control for the series here, where there was no T2. And the bars are the amount of Ramularia that we were getting on the top two leaves. So the ones to pick out for you there, you see some control from Proline and some control, improved control there from Revistar. So that matches what you've just seen in terms of the fungicide performance chart. We were trying a few other things. So Serenade is a biological, a bacillus input not approved for barley. So please note that's an experimental product at this stage. Here's full pit though. So used alone, bringing us some control and some, it's, you know, probably matching the Proline yield there, and it's, you know, giving a sort of, well, the yield lift there is 7.65 in the control, up to 7.82 with the full pit treatment. So this kind of variability in how full pit performs in barley trials is frankly problematic. It sometimes works, but it's not the reliant control that we used to get for chlorothalonil. Other products to maybe pick out there is sort of some efficacy from a sulfur-based product there. So that's interesting in addition. So really where we see full pit being most useful is where it is added into programs rather than being used alone. And of course that rather more reflects how you would be using it. So this is a trial that we had over at our Lanark site. So again, we have an untreated control. We have, if you like, a fairly conventional T2 spray, Comet and Proline, Comet with Alatasera, Comet with Ascra, Comet with Revistar. So we're seeing some Ramularia management from the prothioconazole based actives here. Again, a very marginal improvement there with the Revistar. But here we're subbing in the Arizona and using Siltra. So again, you see that Arizona, the full pit, is adding to the efficacy against Ramularia, although the yield here is somewhat disappointing. So we've not had a yield response to having that full pit inclusion. So, you know, the case for using full pit in wheats is really clear. There probably are some scenarios where it's helpful in barley trials, but it's not as clear cut as the usage in wheat. So just to bring you a few conclusions there on the wheat and the barley, I think in wheat, you know, very clearly, you know, showing the advantage to the Univoc and Revistar newer treatments. Just sharing with you the kind of current situation of SDHIs and septorias, so we know that that decline is there. We showed the data there giving the advantage to Alatasera, but basically we have a good choice of products there. The Revysol and SDHI is highly active on brown rust, fempicoxamide and Inatrec also adding useful activity there. And then the barley that we've just run through there, you know, all diseases better controlled in protectant situations. So I think on the winter barleys this year, we'll be looking at, you know, again, sensible inputs at T1. Prothioconazole and fluxiperoxide are both effective at controlling Rinco and net blotch, so that's encouraging. We see that additional efficacy against Ramularia from the metrifluconazole in Revistar. And again, that I've just tried to be open with you about those kind of mixed results from Arizona. It did show efficacy advantages against ramularia. It definitely is best used in additive programs, but the results are variable, and it remains slightly challenging to know how best to use that. So I just want to finish with a few slides covering fungicide performance in oilseed rape, where we're looking at results from 2 trials, one with ADAS and one with us. Our site for this trial series is out at Bog Hall, and we've already got light leaf spot out at that site this year. So only seeing it where we're incubating leaves overnight in plastic bags. So just keep checking trials. The risk, if you look at the AHDB's risk assessment for light leaf spot this year, the risk has been fairly high based on the weather and then level of spores from last summer. So just keep checking crops. Crops are fairly advanced and dense, which again creates a nice environment for light leaf spot to come through. In terms of how we manage it, you know, we have a broad range of products giving some control and not particularly differentiating themselves in fungicide performance trials. So there's the kind of range of actives that we'll be looking at in the oilseed rape programs, not all of them for light leaf spot management. But you know, again, I always try and encourage you to think ahead in terms of your oilseed rape programs so that you're thinking both of your light leaf spot management actives, but also what you might be using at the flowering sprays to manage sclerotinia, so that you can try and alternate the actives that you're using. So that's the kind of range there. But azoles, STHIs and strobilurins being in the mix there. And we also have Architect in there, which brings a growth regulation along with a strobilurin. So interesting to see results there. So if we look at the light leaf spot disease and yield from the trials last year, you can see there, so where the products are sitting. So, you know, Proline and Aviator running, you know, pretty similar. So no huge advantage to the addition of the SDHIs there, although, you know, again, you would sort of hazard that using mixed products brings some advantages. The Shepherd is a boscalid strobilurin mix. So again, that's quite nice in terms of bringing you a product that reduces reliance on azoles. And here you see the yield responses there. So some differentiation in terms of products. And here is where you do see the advantage to those mixed products compared to the straight Proline. So that was the 2021 results in terms of light leaf spot management. Looking at the slightly longer term trial series, you can see the different actives that we've had in over the years. Obviously, Phelan does not have light leaf spot on the label, but you can see there the light leaf spot management that came through from that treatment in terms of light leaf spot management. But again, you tend to see some of the mixed products coming to the top in terms of yield. So like I say, in my head, that begins to reduce our reliance on azoles. We've managed light leaf spot almost exclusively on azoles alone for a long run of years, if not decades, and seen some kind of issues beginning to build up in terms of azole sensitivity. So I quite like that mixed approach. And again, that's just bringing you some of the yields from that longer term trial series, and maybe particularly to pick out Architect there, which was bringing that growth regulation combined with a strobilurin active. So looking at a yield advantage, certainly compared to, you know, a straight Proline in that situation. You see Aviator perform quite nicely there in terms of yield too. And then thinking of sclerotinia, and yield. So again, you see quite a wide range of products. I think the important thing here is really how closely bunched many of those products are when it comes to, around the 50% dose, which tends to be where we're working when it comes to Sclerotinia management, and what those products are bringing. Feline remains a perfectly acceptable standard for your kind of moderate Sclerotinia risk products. And again, it allows us to alternate away from azole actives in your programs. And again, you can see the sorts of yields that were coming through from those fairly tightly bunched set of products. So like I say, just encouraging a bit of variety into oilseed rape programs. So a quick summary of that, and moving towards my last slides here. So lightly spot, the azoles and the non-azoles, similar levels of disease control, and the yields are similar, perhaps some advantage to those mixed SDHI azole or SDHI strobilurin products. We do see kind of emerging, mutations in terms of azoles, and like leaf spot, that's almost inevitable given the length of time we've been using them. Some decreased sensitivity in laboratory tests, although field performance remains broadly similar. So we don't get the kind of, 100% control, but we get, kind of upwards of 50% control from our existing light leaf spot chemistry. And I think I probably over-labored this point, but trying to get different modes of action into your programs is important. And yeah, just to finish on that note, I mean, the opportunity for better resistance stewardship really does rest on trying to reduce our reliance on any individual particular active. So we know that heavy usage of any particular active ingredient, confers a massive advantage to any resistant individuals in a population. And that's true whether it's net blotch, septoria, Rinco, or light leaf spot that we've just been discussing. So keeping all your available methods in there, mixing, alternating, using low dose multi-sites. I don't get bogged down in the which is better of these scenarios. If you can use them all, then do use them all, and just keep that kind of variety in your programs. And clearly, to finish on a point about tailoring your programs to the risks that you're seeing, I do think there are win-wins there in terms of, improving both your margins and, managing our chemistry going forward. So that is my last slide. I will stop sharing my screen and try and get back to you in the room.
Thank you, Fiona. That was brilliant. If you don't mind, I'm going to ask you a small handful of questions that have come in, and then we'll save some for the end as well. So, Fiona, in high-risk septoria situations, along with varieties which have cougar genes, is there a need to mix the new chemistry together, and at which timing would be best to use them? For example, are mixing Univoc and Revistar, and at what rate?
Oh gosh, I mean, I think that's probably a complication too far. I would perhaps think about mixing them in terms of the overall program, but I wouldn't be mixing them in a tank, if that was where that question was leading. I think the risks of, confounding all the carefully added adjuvants and things remain great there. So I think the kind of the two-way balanced mix supported with a multi-site is where we're at. I think it would be very marginal incremental gains from doing a more complex approach at the moment. I mean, who knows where desperation might drive us going forward.
With the growth stage cutoff for Revisol at growth stage 45 in malting barley, do you think an application at this growth stage is too early for activity against gramularia? Would the T2 be better placed later when the awns are starting to appear?
Yes, so that is a challenge. The better efficacy from Revistar comes with that caveat that if it's destined for a malting market, then that's the cutoff. And yes, that's slightly earlier than we would be treating for gramularia through choice. So horses for courses, I think a prothioconazole based treatment allows you to be in slightly later, and is, you know, probably acceptable in most situations when it comes to the efficacy. Yeah, there's no getting around that, you know, slight challenge of the Revistar cutoff.
Would you mix in Comet along with azoles and SDHDI in high net blotch situations?
I might, yes, and we're seeing, you know, increasing net blotch issues, particularly in some varieties. So that seed-borne element where it's carried through on seed, and a three-way mix for net blotch might, you know, bring additional benefits if you're very aware of that challenge. You would hope that you would know if you had a seed-borne risk through testing. But again, you know, keep an eye on that. If it's a trash-borne issue coming through and you're aware of it, it is challenging to eradicate net blotch now. And, you know, again, the Comets has brought some knockdown. You know, it's been a feature for some of its other uses as well. So, yeah.
This person writes, we're seeing a bit of light leaf spot in our crops, but we wondered if you were seeing any FOMA in oilseed rape.
Very little and none this year. We see it occasionally in crops in the borders, although tending not to develop into any stem lesions. So I didn't show the FOMA fungicide performance slides, which may be where that question is following on from. I don't think it's a major issue yet for our Scottish crops to manage that, and the azole STHI mixes that were shown are generally pretty effective against managing FOMA. I think the issue there, I mean, we often get into debates about whether we're managing light leaf spot once or twice, with the spring timing being a certainty and the autumn one, you know, people come and go about the benefits there. If light leaf spot's in early, then that kind of November timing is useful. Trying to manage FOMA in addition, where we're in much earlier, and it might mean a third input, really in terms of, you know, the margin and cost efficacy of fungicide programs, it becomes very marginal. So again, focusing very much on the light leaf spot management, and not thinking that that third input for FOMA, that third timing, is particularly necessary or helpful to us at the moment.
There's a few questions. I'm going to end on this one though and save a few for the final session. Should we be applying autumn fungicide on rape or not? There's so much conflicting advice in the market.
Yeah, so I kind of touched on this already. There is a debate there. The standard answer is it depends how early light leaf spot comes in, how big an advantage the autumn spray is. So as ever, we're always hugely wise in hindsight. I think this year, where the light leaf spot risk was flagged as being relatively high because of the weather, and we certainly know it's there now, that I think there will probably have been an advantage to the autumn sprays. But again, that's one to base on your region. High risk, northeast, weak varieties. I think I would certainly be using an autumn one. If you're more relaxed, further south and on a more resilient variety, then maybe the spring one's where you're at.
Brilliant, fantastic. Thanks, Fiona. And I'll save a few for the end of the session there for you. Brilliant. Okay, like I said at the beginning, sadly we haven't got Julian with us, so we're going to go straight into our soil session with Amanda Burnett from AHDB and Paul Hargreaves from SRUC. I'll introduce them both now because I think we're going to go from one straight into the other. As we all know, building soil resilience can be the kind of make or break factor in kind of a farm business success and profitability, and it's such an integral part of the business. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Amanda and Paul, who are going to take us through latest developments in soil science and soil health from both organisations. So I think we're going to Amanda first. I'll hand over to you, Amanda.
Brilliant, thank you very much. I will get my presentation up. Hopefully you can see all of that. So thank you for the introduction, Richard. Yes, so this is a joint presentation by myself and Paul. So I'll just introduce myself as working in the environment team at AHDB, but I have been managing a large programme of work funded by AHDB over the last 5 years on soil biology and soil health. So Our overall topic is systematic approaches to soil management, but I'm going to just sort of set the scene a little bit and talk about this programme of work that AHDB has funded in support of all our sectors. My contact details are on the screen if you would like to get in touch with me afterwards with any questions as well.
Amanda, you might need to just reshare your screen. It did come up and then it's gone again.
Oh no, hold on.
Sorry.
Okay. Sorry, hang on a second. I knew there'd be a technical hitch. Right, you can see my screen?
Yes. You seem to be able to.
You can see
that. Perfect. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt you.
I'll hide that bit. No, that's very sensible. Okay, right. So yeah, contact details if you want to get in touch with me. So just wanted to set the scene a little bit. Thinking about soils and all of the incredible functions that they deliver around ecosystem services, really, looking at the very big picture. This is an infographic from the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, but I really like it because it shows such a diversity of functions that soil delivers, and actually so many of them are relevant to agriculture. Not only the provision of food, fibre and fuel, thinking about environmental factors as well, such as carbon sequestration or water purification, climate regulation with greenhouse gases, looking at nutrient cycling, habitat for organisms, flood regulation. You know, all of these things are relevant to agricultural soils, and we have a role to play in helping to deliver them. But of course, all soils are different. So I've just put up my array of soil profiles here just to demonstrate that visually. And that's not just down to the soil texture, the soil type. Obviously, we have a huge range of soil types across the United Kingdom. It's not only down to the stoniness and the characteristics of that soil and its geological origins, but also due to those management practices. So it's the cropping rotation, has there been grass, are there organic material inputs, what other inputs have gone into the system, and all of these different things and those management approaches, what cultivations there have been, they change the soil to be unique. So there's not one size fits all solution to understanding or managing soils. Because they really are unique to a site because of those inputs and management approaches over time. Just want to run through some principles though, because although soils are different and unique to their situation, we can think about them in terms of the chemistry, the physics and the biology. And there are some principles around whatever the soil type is and whatever situation it's in as to how we can go about managing them to maintain a healthy soil, keeping these three elements in balance. So the first of these is thinking about the physical side of soil. So understanding what the soil texture is, to be able to understand the limits to its workability, the trafficability, that's an inherent property of the soil. And if you think about a clay soil, for example, and a sandy soil, just those inherent properties will determine how much organic material can be held in that soil. So understanding the soil texture is really the foundation of understanding soils and in their entirety. Soil structure, the below ground architecture of the soil. This is where obviously there's the water movement, but where plant roots live and grow and access nutrients and interact with soil organisms. So that's soil structure. To have a good structure with an effective continuous pore space is really, really important. And optimizing water balance as well. So, we don't want waterlogged soils, we don't want completely droughted soils either. But if there is an issue with drainage, then that can be something that can be rectified and look around bringing that soil structure, water balance back together. Thinking about the chemical environment of the soil, so maintaining an optimum pH is really critical, actually, and I know Paul is going to talk a little bit more about this in his part of the presentation. But it's something that can be managed, but actually it impacts on many other factors around soils as well, including nutrient availability to the crop. Providing plant nutrients in the right amounts in the right place at the right time. So this is obviously important for crop yield, but from an environmental perspective as well, you don't want to have any issues with environmental pollution from diffuse, from runoff and diffuse pollution. And finally, thinking about the soil biology. So soil biology and the organisms that live and work in the soil, these are delivering many of those functions that I showed in the first slide. So there are things that we can do. So feeding the soil. So what I mean by that is feeding the soil organisms regularly with organic matter, and that will keep those biological cycles going. Moving soil only when you have to, so thinking about that habitat below ground and those networks below ground for that soil organisms live in, so actually not disrupting that habitat. And diversifying crops both in space and time, so thinking about rotation or growing crops together, intercropping, companion cropping, using cover crop mixes. That diversity above ground will provide diversity below ground as well, and will really bring to life all that soil biology to deliver those functions. So we have all these sort of general principles around what we need to understand around an integrated approach to soil physics, chemistry, and biology. But what we are thinking about is how do we go about measuring that? How can we monitor that over time so that we know that the management practices that we are using are either maintaining or improving the soil health? So we wanted to focus really on these three elements, the physics, chemistry, and the biology, and wanted to think about a way of routinely monitoring this on a rotational basis to be able to track changes and track progress. This was one of the aims of the Soil Biology and Soil Health Partnership. So this was co-funded by AHDB and the British Beet Research Organisation, a 5-year programme of work with a large consortium of partners, academic and industry, to deliver on a very large programme of work with many interlinked projects. But overall, the main aims were to develop and validate a soil health scorecard approach to be able to measure and monitor soil health routinely on farm, and also to improve our understanding around soil biology in UK agricultural systems and the drivers of soil biological functioning. So to start out with this partnership, there were 3 main work packages, and the first of these was looking at benchmarking and baselining activities. And this took place in 2017, 2018 at the start of the programme of work, really to set the scene, find out what was already known, what was already out there, because we didn't want to start from scratch. Obviously, we want to build on from existing good work that's already already out there and available. The second work package was then to take that information and do set up a series of research trials and different projects looking at measuring and optimizing the long-term impacts of soil management. So here we were looking at a series of long-term experiments. These were sites that had already been established through other partnerships and bits of work in the past, and using those long-term sites to look at the drivers of soil biology. So there was a site looking at drainage and improved drainage, site looking at cultivation and different tillage. These are really looking at how the physical side of changing soil, how that impacted on the soil biology and function. We have a long-term site looking at different pH ranges, and I'll talk about that a little bit. I've got an example of that coming up. And different cropping rotation as well. So looking at how different crops in the rotation with their different returns to soil and different root exudates, for example, how that changes that environment below ground, which will drive the soil biology. And finally, looking at organic amendments, so different types of material, whether that's farmyard manure or different slurries or composts, and the impact that they have over time as well, in terms of what they're made of and their different types of organic amendments and the impact that has on soil biology and soil health. The third work package really looked at knowledge exchange, and we wanted this to be right from the beginning of the partnership. It was really important to get that, and we achieved that with the benchmarking and baselining activities in the first year. But all the way through, there has been feedback and working with farmer groups to learn about what their innovations were on farm, and as well as looking at these long-term experimental sites, we also had a series of 8 farmer innovation groups around the UK, and Elizabeth Stockdale from NIAB led on this work to have that engagement with the different groups and their different production systems to get feedback on the soil health scorecard approach. So I'm just going to run through what the scorecard contains. And to start with, there were a number of different indicators that could have been chosen for soil biology and soil health. And if you look in the academic literature, there are in fact hundreds of things that could be used, certainly in research as well. But these were narrowed down to a set of indicators that would focus on the physical side of soils, so looking at a visual evaluation of soil structure, using penetrometer resistance, and looking at bulk density. On the chemistry side, pH, routine nutrient analysis, and looking at soil organic matter using the loss on ignition method, total nitrogen, and potentially mineralizable nitrogen as well. This does have an overlap with the biology because the potentially mineralizable nitrogen is what would be released through the activity of microbial populations in the soil. But looking at the soil biology, going from sort of large groups such as earthworms down to mesofauna, so these are the springtails and the mites, very important in the soil food web, through to nematodes and the different ecological groups of nematodes, whether they are plant parasites, whether they feed off bacteria, feed off fungi, feed off other nematodes. So a range of different community ecotypes of nematodes as well. And looking at microorganisms in terms of their biomass, their activity and respiration. And we also had a parallel set of projects that were slightly more fundamental, looking at DNA measures, both of soil-borne pathogens and beneficial organisms that would be involved in maintaining healthy soil functions. So this was the short list, as it were, of the indicators that were going to be used within the partnership programme. Some of them had a lot of information already around what would be considered a good value or a poor value, whereas others were a bit more novel in that we don't have that interpretation framework yet. And some were definitely being looked at more on a research capacity side, and some looking more at what can be practically done on farm as a routine way of monitoring and measuring soil health. So the ones I have left in the dark text are the ones that were taken forward to work with our farmer groups that we worked with around the country to get feedback on the approach. And so that is a visual evaluation of soil structure, looking at the physics, a suite of pH, nutrient analyses and soil organic matter that would be done at a laboratory, and earthworms as an indicator of soil biology, and that would be done at the same time as the visual evaluation of soil structure. So the idea is that as a farmer, you would go out to the field to a specific location, which could be GPS referenced or geolocated, and so that you can go back to it over time. And the idea is that you would take this set of measurements, and then over the course of a rotation or over time, you would go back to the same place and do the same set of measurements again. And that would give you sort of a benchmark, and then you'd be able to monitor whether those indicators of soil health were changing as a result of whatever management approaches had been used at that site. So the idea is to go out, take a visual evaluation of soil structure, count the earthworms in that spade full of soil as well, and at the same time take subsamples of soil to send away to the lab for those routine analyses. I'm just going to give you an example of what the soil health scorecard looks like. It is a visual tool. So the idea is that the tests that you would do, so here I've got them arranged with the pH and the nutrients and the soil organic matter that would be done at the lab, the visual evaluation of soil structure, and the number of earthworms that would be found. The idea is that the results that come back from these tests would be looked at against a set of threshold values that we have worked on within the program of work, and get those benchmarks. If it flags up, or if the result is outside of the expected range, then it might flag up as red, as something to investigate. So this is really quite out of what should be found at that soil type in that location. If it's amber, it's something to review, so it's sort of borderline. And if it comes up as a green, fits in that green traffic light, it's something that's within those expected ranges, and you can continue then rotationally monitoring that particular attribute to see how that changes. So this is the scorecard that was done at Cravestone, and it is a long-term experiment where the plots have a pH gradient. So we looked at 4 different pH values within this trial. There are more, but that's pH 4.5, 6, 6.5, and 7.5. And at each of these plots, these different tests were done. And really what jumps out at you is that at this low pH, we have these sort of red flags coming up, which indicate that there is something that could be addressed there that might need to be investigated, whether it's an interaction with nutrient availability, or perhaps that the earthworm numbers are low here because earthworms aren't overly keen on particularly acidic soils. So this is really just to give you a demonstration of what the scorecard looks like. And at pH 6.5, which is what is more normal for arable cropping, for example, that actually this means that everything is coming up green, so it's as expected. Earthworm numbers are a bit low, but they were a bit low across these other pH ranges as well. So I'm going to hand over to Paul, who's going to talk a little bit more in detail about the different tests and where the traffic light boundaries are for those different values. So that's me for now, but I will be back. I will be back at the end.
Thank you very much, Amanda, for setting the scene there. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to ask people behind the scenes just to load my slides up and do the next slide, please. I'm having a bit of a stability problem with my internet connection today, I'm afraid. So hopefully, if you can bear with me, that would be really helpful. So yes, I was just going to try and look at some more practicality of the scorecard. As you can see, this is if you move, you can move on to the next slide. Thank you. Thank you. This is just a sample scorecard that I've put together, showing 3 fields, 2 arable and 1 grassland, and some potential problems within that field. What the analysis of that field using the scorecard system of the pH and the nutrients, the soil organic matter, the soil structure, and the earthworms have indicated there. Whereas we're looking at field 1, we're looking at relatively positive aspects as far as soil quality is concerned. The pH may be just slightly too high, but it's not a problem at the moment. It's within the good, but continue monitoring aspects of that. It looks like the nutrients may need a little bit of attention and maybe some top dressings there just to ensure that they move up and not down. The second field, the arable field, again, the pH seems to be fine there. We need to just check some of the nutrients. However, it might be worth looking at the soil organic matter and thinking of a way of maintaining that within the field and maybe improving that within the soil itself. But what seems to be indicating there by a lack of earthworm numbers and the limiting layer for the FAS is that there's a soil structural problem there. and that really needs to be addressed within that field, as that would probably be starting to affect the yield of that field. In the grassland field, and we're starting to look at a low pH there, and this is, as Amanda said, with some of the Craigstone plot experiments, this is affecting the numbers of earthworms there. We're seeing reduced numbers of earthworms within that area, as earthworms are pH sensitive. Other things to look at there is the soil structure. We need to monitor that, maybe in a little that we don't whatever management is happening on that field isn't starting to make that worse, and maybe think about management schemes to improve that. If it's grassland, if it's animals that are causing that problem, then maybe reducing the time spent on there, maybe slightly better rotation of your animals in the field. Or if it's mechanical aspects of it, then the conditions, how wet it is when you go onto the field. Can you put that in, please? I'm just thinking about the soil chemistry, how important the pH is, just reminding us about this, trying to get an optimum pH of around 2.6 for grassland, 2. Arable crops and horticultural crops. So this affects the take-up of these nutrients here, so it's important about to make the availability of the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and other nutrients within the soil available to that crop. So this is, now we want to think about some of the background to how we've come to the banding colours that you've seen on the scorecards. And if we move on to the next slide, we start thinking about the soil pH. You can move on to the next slide, please. Excellent, thank you very much. No, sorry, if you go back to the pH one, sorry. Excellent, thank you very much. Shows the ranges that give the traffic light systems here. And as everything with soils, we've heard before, they're complicated, they're quite complex systems when you start looking at these in detail. So we've split the pH bands between arable crops, as you can see here, with the ranges as indicated for the different traffic light colours there, highlighting where there's potential problems or low pHs or lower than 5.49, when you can start getting aluminium toxicity there. Thinking about considerations here about your liming and how often you should do that. If you do get a soil analysis done, then this is probably going to come back as with SRUC or SAC, when you send your soils in for analysis, they'll probably recommend the amount of lime that you need to improve the pH of your soil and bring it up to an efficient amount. But these bandings really are showing that the closer you get to the optimum levels of pHs, then the colours change, and you're looking at green for just continue monitoring. And again, green doesn't mean it means that you don't have a problem with this soil per se in relation to pH. However, that doesn't mean you stop dealing with that soil at all and think that's the problem over, we don't have to deal with that again. You need to ensure that you continuously monitor these regular basis, because these pH, other nutrients do change within the soils, and so you need to make sure that you have an idea of how that's changed through time, so you can then adjust your management plan to any changes that you see. And here we see that even at high levels above 7.5, that we've gone back to amber again, saying that the liming levels may be higher than needed, and indicating that there can be problems at high pHs with deficiencies in elements that the higher pH brings out. So, and also the values in the brackets are also relate to grassland, and they're slightly different for this because the amount of lime that you need for grassland and grassland yield is not quite as high as arable crops. So just being aware of that. Next slide, please. Looking up the next slide. Excellent, brilliant, cheers, thank you. Again, just showing the ranges of these. I mean, this is phosphorus. This is in Scotland. Will be modified Morgan's method for doing the analysis of this, and the ranges that you would get from that. Again, it's showing at low levels. Then you need to consider adding P to your system in fertilizers and ensuring that that's brought up to M- or M+ level. Again, as Amanda said, we've not rebanded anything here. We're not really changing anything as far as the FAS technical notes recommend. We've brought those levels and bands into this system here. We're not trying to invent anything new here. We're just trying to bring this data together. Management plans and decisions you can make when you reach certain levels, and trying to indicate an optimum level that you should be aiming for. And again, with phosphorus, it's important to remember there's added information now within the technicals about the underlying soil type in different regions of Scotland and how that affects the amount of phosphorus need to add, and the form of phosphorus that you need to add. And again, here high levels of phosphorus, yes, it's probably not detrimental to the yield of your crops. It's probably detrimental if you've already got sufficient P and you're adding more than you need to the cost of that. But also we're trying to highlight that there is a potential risk to the environment, more or very high levels of P within those soils as they get washed out or washed through the system, attach the soil particles into drains and cause diffuse pollution in water courses. That's why we have the red block traffic light at high levels of P. Next slide, please. And we've got the potassium bands with the traffic light system. Again, just to draw your eye to what you're looking for there. It's also the considerations you need to make here, and also indicating how this interacts with magnesium as well, and any problems that you could have. Staggers basically from grazing crop and low magnesium. So, slide please. Yes, there we go. So again, this is magnesium slide. We've got the traffic light system as before. Again, we're drawing attention to very high levels of magnesium, so trying to think about the considerations you would need for that. And again, it's based on technical notes that are already being produced by the Farm Advisory Service, and also on the background information as well from the old RB 209, the nutrient handbook as well. So this is information that's readily available. The bands are based around those. Next slide, please. Now, soil organic matter was an interesting one to put bands to. This is different to the scorecard that's been set up and the bands that have been set up for England, mainly because Scotland in general have a greater percentage of organic material in them, or should have. So the kind of bands that we need are more specific to Scotland, and we try to keep this as almost as specific to each individual field as possible by using the data that's provided by the James Hutton Institute on the Soil Information System database, which if you follow that link will take you through to a map where you can scroll down or scan down to almost field level to know what the soil type is within a specific field or location, and so you can draw out that particular soil series. Then thresholds can be then related specifically to that soil series from the data that's provided on the James Hutton website. If you then click on organic material, loss on ignition, then it'll bring up a graph, and we'll just show a couple of examples of these graphs in the next slide, please. We have two examples here for a Stonehaven series and a Gatti series. You can see that these show the range of organic material that's been or would be expected in these particular soil series, and as you move from left to right across each graph, it shows the different where you'd expect to find these organic materials concentrations within the different depth of the soil profile. So really what we're interested in is the first block, and the red dot in the middle there is the median value for that. So that's the middle value, really, the average for those soil types that have been found during analysis. So in this particular, we're looking at so to calculate how fit light system for your organic matter, if you're looking at in the less than the lower quartile, so less than the box, the bottom of where the range of figures are, and that's anything less than that is considered poor and needs some attention. Needs to think about how you can get more organic material back into those soils. Between the bottom of the spread of range of figures and the median, the red dot in the middle, then that's moderate, but we still have to think about trying to maintain or improve the organic material within that soil. And if it's greater than the median, that's good. We're happy with that, but also we need to think how we're going to maintain that with the system we're running at the moment. If you press the button again, please. And this gives an example with figures now from particular soil type. So anything less than about 5.2% is poor. If we're getting that with this soil type, then we need to really radically think about improving our organic matter inputs with some organic material, or maybe cover crop, or retaining some of the crop residue into the soil to build up the organic material. If it's between 5.2 and 6.5, and it's moderate, and above 6.5 is good. So press the button again, please. Just for completeness, this is for the other soil type, and you can see there is a slightly different range of values there for what consists of poor, moderate, and good. So these will be related to the specific soil type and the soil type you've got in your field or on your farm. The next slide, please. You can probably press the button about 3 or 4 times because things should slide in from the side. We're just thinking about soil structure and how this is really how the particles of soil bind together, how it builds up the soil structure within the soil profile itself. Soil structure is important because this is how the crops link through to the soil. It's also important for water drainage, for water retention, to allow air to get into the soil as well, to be able to be used by the roots and also the microbial populations within the soil. And it's these microbial populations that are important, because these are they do the work of, when you add nutrients to the soil, these break those down, change them around, make them available to the growing crop through the root systems. So they're important. We create spaces, and the correct spaces for these soil microbes to work as efficiently as possible. Next slide, please. And we're using the evaluation of soil structure VES to look at soil structure. This is digging out a block of soil, as you can see in the photos there, pulling that apart and looking at the aggregates within the soil and how those form. And it's looking to see within that block which is the poorest area of soil structure, because that'll be the area that needs more attention to improve the yield, improve the nutrient take up, and improve the soil structure. So we need to focus on that. You don't just get the information of how, when, and where to collect or to assess your soils with the VES sheet. You can press the button again, please. I'm hoping we can see the other side of the sheet, which gives you a lot of information about how to assess your soil structure. Is that not working? Oh, yes, there we go. Excellent. So this is a lot of information how to assess the actual structure itself. And you can tell, it's in some ways, it's self-evident. If you've got soil that crumbles apart, you've got small aggregates to it, that smells good, that looks dark and rich, then it's a good soil structure you've got there. And so that'll give you a score along the top row there of 1, and so you'll be happy with that kind of soil structure. If you're getting structure that looks like the bottom row, then we need to really think about how we're going to manage this and what we're going to do to prevent this happening in future. If we do, then put more structure back into it. Here we're seeing large platy structures, very dense, not many pores, holes in there for water to move through. It can smell quite bad, kind of a bad egg smell. It can have a kind of bluish grey tinge to it as well. And the aggregates are quite large sized and difficult to break up. So again, if we're looking at that, we need to think about soil management, and that would be giving us score as far as the VES is concerned. Next slide, please. And these are just a couple of examples looking at what we would say was good soil structure and what was poor soil structure. Next slide, please. And just moving on to soil biology, earthworms have been chosen as we're hoping most people will find earthworms. If you don't, then it's indicating there's a problem with that soil. Earthworms are used because they're useful indicators of the conditions that are similar for good crop growth. They like similar kind of pHs. They like aerated soils. They don't like waterlogged soils. They're also where reduced tillage, so in the similar kind of situations that would start to increase your organic matter within the soils, you tend to get more earthworms. And also they seem to be sensitive to compaction. So if there's soil structural problems, you'll see this indicated in earthworm numbers as well. So next slide, please. And just to illustrate some of this is some data that I got from a farm up in the north east of Scotland from one of the consultants there. They'd done some digging blocks of soil and counted earthworms across a number of fields on the farm, and they were saying, well, I'm not really sure what this is telling us, if we can use this. There's some areas that have got a lot of earthworms in the field, some fields have got a lot of earthworms, some of them don't. So is it really telling us anything? And basically what I said was, if we can have a look at where the fields are, maybe where you've taken them in the fields, then this will tell us more about what's going on. And so if you could press the button again, please. And this is what we found when we added that information. In the first field, that we were getting earthworms in the middle of the field. It was obviously a heavy used field, a grassland field there. There was a cattle feeder and the sample had been taken around there. We didn't get any earthworms at all, indicating there was probably a lot of soil damage there and potentially waterlogging. Again, there was a wet area of the field, again waterlogging, so there was no surprise we weren't getting many earthworms there. Again, the next field was a grassland field, but heavy use of that, a lot of traffic on there, using some kind of byproduct as well, which would reduce the earthworm numbers. Then you moved on to a field that was in grass for 5 years plus, and again this showed that with reduced disturbance, the inputs to the grassland fields, potentially the more organic inputs, you were seeing a lot more earthworms there. Move on to where the stubble is from the arable field, you were getting less earthworms. We weren't surprised by that now, because there's a lot of tillage, there's a lot more earth movement, so this is activity that disturbs earthworms, and you would expect less earthworms in an arable situation. And again, the last 4 or 5 fields are all grassland fields. Some of them have been there 5+ years, so that's up the conditions for to promote earthworms and earthworm activity. So with no surprise then that we were seeing a lot more earthworms in that situation. Next slide, please. And again, we're just here with the earthworm numbers with arable crops. These are the numbers we're expecting here, and some of the considerations about intensity of tillage, organic matter inputs that we could think about to try and improve earthworm numbers, and hopefully as a proxy for the whole soil biology of the soils within those particular situations. The next slide, please. So we should see a grassland earthworm numbers, and if you look at the number expected per spadeful, this situation here, we've changed the numbers that you would expect accordingly as far as a grassland concerned. So reflecting the fact that you would expect to see more earthworms in a grassland situation. So again, to reflect whether that's a good situation or a poor situation, and what considerations that you could undertake to try and then improve your numbers, your soil quality, soil biology for a grassland system. Next slide, please. And so we just come back to the scorecard again that we started with. Hopefully now you've got a bit more understanding about how these bands have been created, what they mean, and what kind of considerations or things to think about to try and improve that soil quality based on the information that we put there for the scorecard. Next slide, please. And just bringing this back, just to go back to the point that Amanda was making right at the start, really we've moved on now from thinking just about soil as something that you add nutrients to, put your crop in, crop uses nutrients, harvest crop, start again. We're now thinking more about how those nutrients, how the systems and the management of that soil is affecting the soil in general, and bringing into the soil chemistry story, the aspects of soil physics and how that interacts with the chemistry, and the soil biology and how that starts to interact with both the chemical and physical components of the soil to make a more rounded understanding of what we mean by soil quality and how we can maintain that soil quality for improved or crop yields. Next slide, please. So in summary, I would emphasize to everybody to get to know your soil, what's your soil texture, how that's going to be important is overall for soil quality, but using a spade, digging holes, getting your hands dirty. The fact that we've moved into understanding the need to know how the physics, chemistry and biology of the soil interacts. That soil health monitoring is a combination of all these things. We can't just do things in isolation. The importance of organic matter for soil structure and stability, for the drainage and soil moisture retention, and for sites for the microbial activity. Living soil is important for growing crops and for the quality of the crops as well. So we need to think about that, and also how this helps us then think about mitigation measures to try and stop or improve our soil quality if we found it to be in a poor state. And I can't emphasize enough, we need to know what the state of the soil is to start off with. We need to monitor that through time, so then we can manage that soil for to retain its ability to provide the best yields for the crops. And I think I'm almost at the point where I'm handing back to Amanda now, just to highlight some of the information that's available. If you move on to the next slide.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Paul. Really appreciate all that insight into how we developed and looked at the traffic light system and those benchmark thresholds. So what Paul and I have really taken you through is an approach to think about soil management, or where to identify focal areas for soil management, looking, as Paul said, in that holistic way, an integrated way around physics, chemistry and biology. And the scorecard approach is a visual tool that helps flag up those areas where some management changes may be required. What it doesn't tell you is what exactly you need to do. So, for example, if you have organic matter has flagged up as needing some attention, what you need to know then is where to find out some more information about what are the options for your farm and your situation on your soil type for improving that soil organic matter. So what we have at AHDB on our Great Soils website, we have a range of different resources that provide information around all of these subject areas around soil management. So I've just put a selection on the screen at the moment. There are many available online on the Great Soils website, as I said. If you're looking at arable soil management, which will take you through a range of different cultivation practices, if you're looking to reduce cultivations, field drainage, looking at healthy grassland soils, in particular, bringing together the physics, chemistry, and biology, and how to get what examples of what to do in a grassland situation. We have information on earthworms and soil food web and organic matter, and videos as well. So if you want to sit and watch a short video on how to do an assessment of soils, we have this information available. Could I just have the next slide, please? We have an ongoing project at AHDB as well to make our information more readily accessible online via the website. So we have a knowledge library. So if you just go onto the AHDB website and click on the knowledge library, this can bring up searchable web pages, which is another format. So we have a guide, the principles of soil management, which is a hard copy publication you can order. It's now also available as searchable web pages. So if you were interested in soil organic matter, for example, you just can go down there and click on that, and that will take you to further information on that. So next slide, please. So I've just put up this really the last slide just to signpost you to the AHDB information. So the soil management information on what might be most suitable for your farm, Great Soils, the knowledge library if you want to have a look through searchable pages, but also to access research reports if you want more of the technical detail around some of the work we have funded. The Soil Biology and Soil Health Partnership is our 5-year programme of work. It's coming to an end now. We will have more research reports, and the lookup tables for those benchmark values that Paul showed in his presentation will be available on there. And if you are interested in a bit more information about how the Soil Health Scorecard has been used at our long-term experimental sites, there's a video that Anne Bogle from ADAS kindly did for us, which explained the different drivers for soil biology and talked through the scorecard examples that were resulting from those long-term experiments. So there's the Cravestone example with the pH, and we have various ones with organic material amendments, and also looking at a site where we had difference between no-till and ploughed soil. So that's a 7.5 minute video if you want to have a quick catch up on the Soil Health Scorecard. But yes, just signposting you to all the other information that AHDB has on the topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Amanda. Fantastic. That takes us straight into the panel Q&A session. I'll save behind some questions for this. So if I could ask all our panelists to turn their cameras on, and we'll do a quick fire session here. So we're going to keep your answer succinct. There's a few questions to come in. Right. First of all, Steve, given that maltsters reject on skidding, are there any comparative trials for different varieties?
Yes, the best information nowadays comes through the evaluation done on varieties at national list stage. So varieties will only have, say, 1 or 2 years on that particular measure. So I'm in discussion about how we might utilise that. But bearing in mind, it's just at most 2 years for each variety. But we could, with AHDB, do more. So so we could work with you to do more. Yeah.
Thank you, Steve. Fiona, for a variety like Firefly, which has seen septoria ratings lowered in the new recommended list ratings, and in situations where it has been early drilled, the septoria score is sitting just above 4. What would be the best strategy for keeping septoria under control in this variety in a high-risk wet season?
Yes, so that's kind of the worst of all scenarios. And I think the main difference in how I would manage that would be around the T1 timing. So if you regard the T1 inputs as kind of entry level with some of the older mixture products like, say, Aviator, we could upgrade to a higher SDHI loading in something like Ascra, or you could actually move to something like Revistar as the kind of, one of the brand new products. And then obviously at the flag leaf timing, use one of the, again, most robust products. So that would be, in that scenario, if I'd use Revistar early, I would use Univoc later, and I would put the full put in at both timings. So that would be my kind of most robust entry for that worst case scenario. The T0, I think even in a scenario like that, I would probably only do the T0 if there was yellow rust there, but that's one that I think we could debate for hours. The reality might well be that you have both together and you would do a low dose azole and a straw.
Thank you. Paul, why did you change the pH bands for grassland? Grass is a crop like any other, and more importantly, fertilizer nutrient efficiency is related to soil pH and not to the crop grown in that soil. You able to just provide some background to that? I don't know, Paul, near us.
Sorry, yeah, if you could just repeat that again. I'm having unstable connection problems, I'm afraid.
We'll try one more time, but if not, we'll knock that one on the head. Why did you change the pH bands for grassland? Grass is a crop like any other, and more importantly, fertilizer and nutrient efficiency is related to the soil pH and not the crop grown in that soil.
No, it's because to do with the general conditions that you're growing grass in. It tends to be more acidic, becomes more and more expensive and more difficult to get that last bit of pH as if you were moving it into an arable crop. And arable crops tend to be a bit more sensitive to pH, so maintaining that slightly higher pH band is important.
Thank you, Paul. Fiona, have you examined the role of trace elements in plant health and disease resistance in combination with the fungicides, for example, with Ramularia and Septoria?
Yeah, I mean, this is an area of huge interest to us all, and I know, you know, it's a particular feature at the strategic farm, the AHDB strategic farm in Fife. So yeah, that interaction between the broader elements of plant health and how well nourished it is really interesting. There are pluses and minuses. I think for the major diseases like Septoria, it will be a challenge, you know, to manage through, you know, nutritional elements. For something like Ramularia, though, I think where we know it's strongly linked to the stresses, there's much more potential to manage the crop kindly. I mean, the obvious statement of eliminating, you know, deficiencies is really clear. But like anything, there's a kind of blend there where you have things like sulfur that cross between plant nutrition and a fungicidal action. There's a whole piece there about how easy it is to, you know, register products in and around that nutritional biological area as well. So yeah, that's a long way of saying it's a really key shared interest. I think for some of our major diseases, it will remain a challenge. For things like Ramularia, definite potential.
Thank you very much. Steve, what winter wheat variety would suit a low input system? I assume the question is kind of looking at kind of what traits would you look for in a variety for a low input system? Oh, I think you're on mute, Steve.
Yeah, I think the main issue will be on the disease control, and so I think what we're trying to do with the list is to bring in varieties that have got a good untreated yield. Say in the absence of fungicides, that's really why we've gone down the route of bringing in varieties like KWS Palladium. Although it's a milling wheat, we just want to have a closer look at that to see where there is value in that type of variety, and that's something that's fairly stiff as well. So that's what I'm thinking about. Wider value is that untreated yield and features like stiff straw, because that could also give flexibility with drilling date as well. So that's why we're beginning to introduce these sorts of varieties with the good untreated yield.
Steve, I know the treated yield is real belt and braces approach to really kind of show the potential of that variety. But would there be any plans in the future, do you think, to have a more kind of commercially viable approach to like an intermediate kind of way to looking at the varieties that are more commercially viable? Yeah,
we've discussed this with AHDB over a number of years now, and there have been some other trials that have been done with these sort of a range of inputs, sort of intermediate inputs, and Fiona may say a bit more about that as well. So there's scope for doing that, but I think we need to think about the choice of sites for that type of trial, and possibly how we make best use of other on-farm work. So it's about bringing information together from official trials and using other sort of on-farm trials where we can analyse sort of sensitivity to different inputs.
I don't know if you wanted to come in, any concluding thoughts there, Fiona?
Yeah, I mean, I presented certainly in the summer and last roadshows the end of a long series of work with AHDB looking at variety and drill date and sow density as being, you know, drivers. So just to kind of agree with Steve, there's definitely potential for lower inputs where, you know, the drilling date is later and the variety is more robust. So that kind of did come through nicely in that trial series. I didn't present it again today. Usually what we see is the varietal driver emerges more strongly later in the season, and at the minute, at this time of year, it's usually all about when the crop was drilled. So you need to keep both in mind when you're planning your scenarios. But, you know, absolutely, we shouldn't be treating, you know, I gave the earlier example of a very high risk scenario and what I would do. We can't do that as a blanket over everything. The art is, picking the lower risk ones.
I know it's a funny time of year to ask this, but are we seeing the impact of losing any seed treatments from the scenario? Is that, do you think we're seeing any impact there?
Well, I mean, that actually raises a whole other piece that, where we were relatively early drilled and we've had a benign autumn, the risk of, things like tackle and ice spot are exacerbated. The kind of scenario where we now can't manage early yellow rust, we're definitely paying for that, and it has to come into our T0 thinking. So yeah, I mean, that yellow rust early management is probably the biggest loss.
Thank you. Amanda, given the cost of P&K currently, should we be considering chopping more straw? What do you think?
I think you need a holistic view on this, on the farm business economics. So obviously, chopping straw and returning that residue to the field, there will be some nutrient contained in that. I'm assuming that's the reference there. But straw in itself, it's quite high carbon content, takes quite a long time for microbes to break it down. So in terms of thinking a bit more broadly, perhaps about other materials that could be applied or brought back onto the farm, use of green manures or compost, or farmyard manures and so on, would all provide that nutrient value through the application of organic material. But I guess that would depend on, say, the economics about it in terms of where those materials can be sourced from locally and the cost of spreading and things like that. So I'll leave that as it depends on the farm business situation. I don't know if Paul has any additional comments on that one.
No, I think that's there. I mean, obviously there's some intrinsic value there, but yes, it takes a lot longer to break down. So like you said, if there's other sources available, then you'd probably be looking at that as a quicker fix. But if it's there, then decide whether you're going to use it.
Steve, why were cougar virulence isolate issues less prominent in Scotland? Would it be to do with the conditions up with you? Is there any kind of commentary on that?
That was about the cougar. It might be that we're using fewer of the varieties with that parentage. So if you look at the range of varieties in those groups, and a lot of the varieties were quite early in their development anyway. So it could be that, but I guess, Fiona, doesn't this relate to geographic spread anyway in the pathogen?
Yeah, no, I would sort of concur with that. We didn't see the cougar issues as much, and it probably just relates to how widely deployed those genes are. And we know that our septoria is slightly different, even in terms of SDHI and azole sensitivity, for example. It's evolved to what's predominantly used in Scotland. So yeah, it tailors itself to whatever we're using.
Yeah.
Fiona, what is in your opinion, what is the single most important factor to combat resistance? Variety, chemistry, or...
I tried to fudge this by saying I wouldn't choose one, I would use them all. The single most... I think the most practical one is to use mixtures. And I think that's probably the one that sticks out. But I mean, not really joking that I would use as many as I could, and try and minimize your usage of any one particular thing. But yeah, I knew I would get pinned on that one.
One for Steve. You touched on blended varieties. It would have been helpful to have Julian here to kind of talk about the end market of there. But do you have any opinions on whether there would be resistance from the end users in the market for these blended varieties to come out?
Yeah, well, this is something we've considered in barley and in wheat, and it depends on the markets. And we kind of cycle this sort of discussion where there's sometimes where we're quite enthusiastic about growing blends of feed barley or soft distilling wheat. So there still is value in terms of consistency in performance for those markets, but for the I suppose the premium markets, the single cultivar type malt distilling, no, there will still be an issue about how blends or diversity is used within those sectors.
Brilliant. Sticking with you, Steve, what's the safest late date for spring sowing of wheat?
Yeah, the AHDB and the breeders do guide this, and it's all about risk as we come from January into February, and soil temperature and air temperature increasing. So variety safe dates tend to vary from, say, end of January to end of February. So look at the latest values on the AHDB list. It just means that the later you go, then the more chance you have of not achieving those low temperatures for vernalization.
I'll start with Amanda, and I don't think this is written as a criticism. Are there any elements of the scorecard which aren't taken into account? Obviously, the scorecard covers many of the elements of soil health, but are there any others that we should acknowledge that it doesn't take into account? So possibly the subsoil health. I don't know. Is there anything that other people can look at aside to it?
Absolutely, yes. So the scorecard approach will be that sort of where we have these benchmark values. So obviously, when you're out looking to take those samples in the field, observations are absolutely key. So just generally is there surface ponding of water, just those visual signs of that there's an issue with the soil that needs to be sort of noted and observed and monitored as well, and absolutely about the subsoil. So that is something that that there is a subsoil VES, visual evaluation of soil structure at the subsoil level. There is information on that. The scorecard in itself, as it currently stands with those universal indicators that are sort of covering physics, chemistry, and biology, is kind of the foundation level of where you would want to go and just take a starting point with those in-field observations. If there is a problem, there are other tests that can be done. There are other things you can look at, and certainly, if there is awareness of an issue with the subsoil, then that can be brought in as well. So yes, there are sort of links off to other tests that can be done to get further detail once an area is being flagged up as being of concern.
Thank you, Amanda. One for you, Paul. In this country, we're experiencing kind of bigger extremes with longer dry and wet periods, and they're more extreme as they go. What's your advice on kind of how can we build more resilient soils to cope with these extremes when it is dry or excessively wet?
Oh, that's a big topic. Yes, I can understand the concerns there. I mean, initially, and this sounds like I don't want to sound like a stuck record, but trying to introduce more organic material into your soil and into your systems is really important there. And we've seen that not just in this country, but work I've done in sub-Saharan Africa is if you start adding more organic material, this acts for sites for retaining moisture. So like I said, like little pieces of sponge within the soil, they'll hold the moisture longer, so making that available to the plants for longer. Conversely, and this may seem slightly odd, but because it's like pieces of sponge, it lets water run through it as well. So it does help in drainage. So in heavy rain systems, it should allow drainage to move through as well. The other thing I would say is using things like the scorecard and the different aspects of that. My background is in soil structure, so you'd probably say, well, he would say this, but thinking about the soil structure, the soil, any damage that you've got there, be it at the surface and surface capping, which could only be a couple of millimeters thick, But if it's there and it's not allowing the water to percolate through the soil, any heavy rainfall then will hit the surface and run off, taking soil particles with it, so you get erosion problems there. But also wherever your limiting layer is within the soil, where if you think you've caused damage to your soils, then it's worth going out and checking and seeing. And again, as Amanda's highlighted, the fact that there may be some subsoil problems, and we're not really looking at that with the scorecard. But yes, if everything's perfect in your upper part, then and you're still having problems, then it may be worth looking at that. And also, which caused, I didn't used to like asking this question because I thought it was a bit too much, about thinking about drainage within your farms and whether they're working or not, and whether you've got drains if you're having problems with soil water. And also, just one thing that we don't do regularly on the soil card, but I think it's important to know what texture your soil is to start off with. So if you've got a sandy soil, you may have different problems or different considerations to think about in relation to if you have a heavier clay soil. So just knowing that full picture there, it could be really important in how you design, how you manage your soils. So hopefully that's useful.
Thank you, Paul. I think sticking with you here, is it possible to say anything about the use of humic and fulvic acids in both nutrient and crop protection programs?
Sorry, I just didn't quite get the types of acid there. Is that
humic and fulvic?
I mean, these are things that people have been suggesting. These are organic materials. They have got the place. Humic acids and humus itself should be building up in your soils the more you add organic materials. This is a kind of very, very slow breakdown material of organic materials that build up within, or hopefully should build up within the soils. These are really important sites for microbial activity, for the chemistry within the soil as well, because they charge particles. They exist for a long time within the soil. It is a kind of colloidal material. So yes, they should be, if you're adding organic material to your soil, up naturally over time. And so adding these extra sprays, yes, it's a short-term fix, but I think really you need to address the build-up and the increase or maintenance of your organic material within your soil in general, thinking about cover crops, thinking about what organic additions that you can add to your soil.
Thank you, Paul. Sorry to pick on you. Got another one. What are your thoughts on phosphate fertilizer applications on PSC3 soils where soil indexes are high, or should we be applying foliar phosphate instead? Phosphate instead.
Right. Yes, phosphorus on the high pH soils, if I've got the question right, can be a problem there. I think really you're looking at your whole, I would be looking at my whole management scheme there. In the short term, yes, you might change your phosphate type if it's proving difficult to, or you're seeing a loss of or a lack of the effects of a lack of P uptick in the crops. However, if you've got high pH, you're thinking of maybe running that down slightly, saving yourself some money, thinking about your pH management scheme and incorporating that into the whole of your fertilizer management scheme. Because we know that things are expensive, so having too much of a nutrient or lime within the soil maybe seem good insurance, but really we're looking at a balance, how we kind of even things out over the whole field as well. And so maintaining it within those certain bands is probably more sensible. That's why we put the kind of green traffic for that, and hopefully that then starts bringing all your nutrients into the correct balance there.
Thank you, Paul. Fiona, has any further work been done with elicitors in wheat programs?
Yes, so wheat and barley, we're actively looking at options there, both as seed treatments and as early additions to programs. So some potential. And again, I said this earlier, we've a bit of an issue about getting products like this quickly through the system and registered. But yeah, I think they will have a place going forward. And we see results for some of them that mean that they kind of come in at a margin that's acceptable. They're an additional cost, but they bring benefits and reduce pressure on other bits in the programme. So active area of research, Richard.
Thank you. And one last one for you, Fiona. This is kind of thinking further ahead into the future. Will technology and innovations that we're experiencing at the moment, do you think that will kind of lead to improved flexibility into what rates we're using and what products we're applying? What's your thoughts there of where we're going?
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I think we'll look back at just now and think we were kind of flying blind when it came to judging risk. So, we're trying to anticipate fairly big ticket things like weather, variety and sow date, but, and we think in terms of managing whole fields, but increasingly where we can build a more complex picture of the risk, add in those nutritional risks that we're starting to touch on now, and actually manage areas within the field as well as on whole fields. That will just become easier and easier, and we'll take some of the risk and guesswork out of that, being able to go lower with our inputs. So yeah, that for sure will come.
Brilliant. I think I'll draw that to a conclusion there. Thank you to all of the panel there for doing the questions such quick fire. You don't know what's coming next, so it's always quite unnerving for you. So thank you very much. All that leaves me to do is conclude the session today. So with Steve, we've really been kind of hammering home to consider the agronomic features as well as the yield when you're choosing your variety. Fiona's really taken us through the different modes of action that you can take into your program and tailoring that approach to what you're seeing in front of you in your field when you're field walking. And then Paul and Amanda reminded us that there are many ways to measure your soil health, and it's quite a holistic approach required. And again, you're the best judge of that, and you're the best people who can do that. So thank you very much to all of our speakers and panel today. There's also a special behind the scenes thank you to Gemma, who's been running all this for us and keeping us all on track. In terms of the planning and bringing it all together, Fiona was a kind of a key point in doing that, and it's been brilliant to work together again on the roadshows this year. Like I said before, we would have loved to have been in a hotel somewhere and kind of having a good chat with you all. But this has been the best substitute we can get, and the guys have done a great effort today. You will receive a feedback form for after you've closed off the session today. I know we always say this, but that information is very useful for us for planning next year and planning what you want to get out of these sessions. So please don't kind of pass it by without doing. All that leaves me to do, finally, is remind you that on Thursday, the 20th, we've got the next session with Julian taking us through how we can achieve net zero in farming. We've got the session on mitigating high fertilizer prices, and that's a bit of a minefield for farming at the moment, and how we can approach that. And we've got Henry taking us through IPM and how we can use information coming out of farms to make informed decisions for your businesses. And then finally, Yelto taking us to answering the question of what is a competitive how to be competitive in arable growing combinable crops. And then again, we're coming together again on the 26th of January. Thank you very much for being such a brilliant and willing audience today and for all the questions and interaction. It's been a pleasure, and we hope to see you again on Thursday. Thank you very much, and goodbye.